On a snow-heavy night in Boston, Sadie Lawson signed her name to a marriage contract 5 months pregnant, and the man about to become her husband was someone the entire underworld only dared to name behind his back. The Broken King, a mafia boss in a wheelchair, so desperate for an heir that he was willing to place his family name on a child who carried none of his blood. And she, a waitress widowed before her own wedding day, needed to save her younger brother from a sentence that was never his to serve. She had counted every price she would have to pay. But there was one thing she never counted on. Behind that wheelchair, behind the ruthless name that had shadowed 3 generations, there was a man who dragged himself up in the dark, night after night, waging a silent war against his own body for a promise no living soul was ever meant to know. Until that night, in the abandoned boathouse by the frozen lake, she found him lying on the cold wooden floor, beside his overturned chair, and when he pulled her into their first kiss, her eyes fell without meaning to on the cane still resting at their feet. He held her face between his hands, his voice rough and low against her lips. "Look at me, Sadie. This whole city calls me the Broken King. Go ahead and see if you can find one more thing on me that's broken." And in that moment, she finally understood. The most dangerous thing inside Blackwater House was never the guns, nor the cousin circling the throne, nor the locked room on the 3rd floor where a man had died for knowing too much. The most dangerous thing was falling in love with a man the whole world had sworn to her had no heart. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel because the most beautiful stories are still waiting to be told. 3 months before that snowy night, in a hidden corner of South Boston, Rosie's Diner was still glowing at 11 o'clock, its sickly yellow light spilling through steam-clouded windows onto the frozen sidewalk, while Sadie Lawson wiped down the final table of her second shift that day. Her feet were swollen inside a pair of canvas shoes worn thin at the heels, and a dull ache throbbed through her lower back in a way only a woman 2 months pregnant, after standing for 16 straight hours, could truly understand. Still, she tied her apron a little higher than usual, just enough for the thick fabric to conceal the subtle changes slowly growing beneath her shirt. It wasn't because she was ashamed. She simply couldn't afford to lose this job. The last customer had left a $5 tip on the coffee-stained tabletop, and Sadie did what she had done thousands of times before. She folded the bill into quarters, smoothed every crease with her thumb, then tucked it into the smallest compartment of her faded leather wallet, the one marked with a handwritten scrap of paper bearing 2 words, Mom and Sunday. She didn't count it again. Counting only made a person realize how little there was. The bell above the door rang as she was turning the last chair upside down onto the table. 2 men stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of their coats, and Sadie knew at once they hadn't come for a late meal. 7 years of waiting tables had taught her to read people by the way they crossed a threshold, and these 2 entered as though the diner had belonged to them for years. They moved slowly, never glanced at the menu, and kept their eyes fixed only on her. The taller man pulled out a stool at the counter and set down a thick stack of papers bound in a gray plastic cover. "Ms. Lawson?" he asked, though his voice made it clear he wasn't truly asking. Sadie put down her cleaning cloth and let her hands fall calmly at her sides, with the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to standing before bad news. "We're here about Daniel Reeves's debt," he said, opening the file with 2 fingers, as though he were turning over a deck of cards whose ending he already knew. Sadie's heart tightened when she heard that name spoken by a stranger. Danny had been in the ground for 2 months, yet the numbers he'd left behind were still alive, still breathing, still coming to knock at her door at 11 o'clock at night. Hospital bills, the man read in an even voice. Back rent, an unsecured personal loan, loans from places that aren't licensed to lend money. $42,000 in total. "You've been making payments to 6 different creditors for the past 2 months, haven't you?" Sadie nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I haven't missed a payment," she said. The man smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "That's the problem, Ms. Lawson. There aren't 6 creditors anymore. One person bought every note and consolidated the entire debt. That person would like to discuss new terms." He turned to the last page of the file, pulled out a photograph, and slid it across the counter toward her. "And that person thinks you should see this before you refuse anything." The photograph had been taken from across the street and was blurred slightly by falling snow. But Sadie recognized the figure immediately. She recognized the moss-green coat she had bought him 2 winters earlier, and even the way he shoved both hands into his pockets whenever he was frightened. Toby, her younger brother, was walking out through the gates of the district police station, his head bowed, his shoulders drawn inward as though he wanted to shrink until he disappeared from the world. "The boy is 19, the debt collector said, his voice almost gentle, and that gentleness frightened her more than any shout could have. "An art student, draws portraits of strangers on the subway. A good kid, good enough to sign paperwork putting an account in his name, for someone he trusted, without understanding what it was. That account has just been flagged in an investigation, Ms. Lawson. If the case moves forward, your brother will have a criminal record before he turns 20. But if someone wanted that file to disappear, it could disappear. Everything depends on the goodwill of the new creditor." Sadie's hands began to tremble, not because she feared for herself. She had been poor all her life. She had lost her father, lost the man she was supposed to marry, and grown accustomed to fate taking one thing after another. But Toby was the final boundary. He was the one thing she had sworn she would never let the world touch. She opened her mouth to speak, but the bell above the door rang again. A man stepped inside. He didn't brush the snow from his coat. He didn't look around. He simply walked straight toward the counter, with the measured steps of someone who had never once been forced to hurry. He was older, dressed in a perfectly tailored black overcoat, and he offered no greeting. He only slipped one hand into the inside pocket of his coat, drew out a small object, and placed it on the wooden counter between Sadie and the file. It was an old silver coin, worn smooth around the edges, stamped with a raised emblem that the diner's yellow light didn't let her see clearly. The sound of metal touching wood was barely more than a whisper. But the 2 collectors heard it as though it were a gunshot. "This debt has a new owner now," the man said, his voice as calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "Go home." Sadie waited for the other men to protest. She waited for threats, for swaggering displays of pride, the kind she had seen from men like them all her life. Nothing came. The taller man stared at the coin on the counter, and every trace of color drained from his face so quickly that Sadie thought he might faint. He closed the file with hands that had suddenly become clumsy, muttered an apology that seemed addressed to no one in particular, and then both men hurried out the door far faster than they had entered. They didn't ask for the photograph back. They didn't dare look over their shoulders even once. The man in the black coat gave Sadie a slight nod, almost courteous, then disappeared into the snow as well, leaving the diner so quiet that she could hear the coffee machine dripping behind her. She stood there for a long time before picking up the silver coin. It was heavier than it looked, bitterly cold against her palm, and beneath the light she finally saw the image engraved across its face. A raven perched upon a broken crown. Sadie Lawson turned the coin between fingers reddened by dishwater, unable to understand whether she had just been rescued or sold. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, inside taverns without signs and silent warehouses lining the harbor, merely describing that coin would have been enough to lower every voice to a whisper. Everyone in Boston's underworld knew whose mark the raven and broken crown belonged to, and they knew that when it appeared on the counter of a poor waitress at midnight, that woman's life, whether she agreed to it or not, had already begun turning in another direction. 3 days later, a cream-colored envelope with no stamp and no postmark was slipped beneath the door of Sadie's apartment. Inside was nothing but a card bearing the address of a law office in the financial district and one brief handwritten line. "Thursday at 10 o'clock, regarding the coin in your possession." It was a signature, no threat. Truly powerful people, Sadie thought as she stood before the towering gray stone building at exactly 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, never needed to threaten anyone, because the whole world had already learned to fear them. Attorney Martin Pierce's office occupied the 19th floor, beyond 2 sets of heavy wooden doors and a secretary whose smile looked very well paid. Pierce himself was a man in his 60s, with neatly combed silver hair, and the eyes of someone who had witnessed too many secrets to be surprised by anything anymore. He invited her to sit, poured tea she didn't touch, then placed a thick leather-bound document in front of her, with the care of a man setting down something fragile. "Miss Lawson," he began, "my client has purchased every financial obligation connected to you, and he would like to propose a complete resolution." Before you read it, I need you to understand that this isn't a new loan, an extension, or any form of debt you have ever known. This is a marriage proposal." Sadie thought she had misheard him. She looked at the elderly attorney, waiting for a smile that would reveal it was some legal metaphor, but Pierce's face remained as flat and still as the wooden desk between them. "My client is Connor Kavanagh," he said, then paused, as though the name required a silence of its own in which to be absorbed. Sadie didn't live in the world of names like that, but even she had heard his. She had seen it in news reports about harbor acquisitions, and heard it whispered by late-night customers at the diner after they had drunk enough to discuss things that shouldn't be discussed. People said the head of the Kavanagh family had been confined to a wheelchair after an explosion. People said his younger brother had died in that same explosion. People said many things, and every one of them was spoken in a lowered voice. She opened the document. The first page listed what she would receive, and Sadie read slowly, one line at a time, with the habit of someone who had spent her entire life examining every paper before signing, because she had never possessed the money to hire anyone to read it for her. The entire debt of $42,000 would be permanently erased. The matter concerning Tobias Lawson would be taken over by the family's legal team, and Pierce emphasized in an even voice that the boy would be publicly cleared as the victim of a fraudulent scheme, not concealed or protected in secret, because his client didn't hide what could be proven. Tobias would receive an educational allowance until graduation. Then Sadie's eyes stopped on the fourth line, and remained there for so long that the words began to blur. Ruth Lawson would receive lifelong care at the finest memory care facility in the Northeast, in a private room overlooking the sea, with a medical team specializing in her illness and no limit on expenses. Her illness. Sadie had never told anyone but Toby about those Sunday afternoons. She had never written it down, never mentioned it to a coworker, never taken her mother anywhere except a community clinic under a combined name. Yet this man she had never met knew. He knew what illness her mother had, knew where she was living, and even knew that what she needed most was a window overlooking the water. A chill moved down Sadie's spine at the same moment something hot and tender rose behind her eyes. She didn't know whether to call the feeling being understood or being dissected. She only knew that no one in the world, not even those who loved her, had ever seen her so clearly. In return, Pierce said, "My client requires a legal and public marriage, along with 3 special provisions that he has instructed me to read aloud, rather than allow you to read silently." He put on his glasses. "First, the child you are carrying will take the Kavanagh name immediately upon birth, will be legally recognized as the child of Connor Kavanagh, and will become the sole heir to the entire estate. Second, the wife will have separate private quarters and will never, under any circumstances, be asked to engage in any form of intimacy unless it is entirely voluntary. Third, the child will never be educated, trained, or used for any business of the family, and this provision may not be revoked by anyone, including my client himself." The room remained silent for a long time after Pierce stopped reading. Sadie looked down at the 3 clauses printed in bold across the white page, and she realized she was trembling, though not from fear. A man is willing to stake his entire fortune to secure an heir, yet writes a law with his own hand forbidding his wife from ever being required to touch him, she said softly, almost to herself. That man condemned himself before I ever had the chance to enter the courtroom. Pierce neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply removed his glasses and polished them with a motion made smooth by long habit. "There is one more thing you should know," he said. "The Council of Families will meet in the spring to decide whether my client retains the right to lead. If he hasn't proven both his capability and the continuation of his bloodline by that day, everything he currently controls will pass into other hands. So time, Ms. Lawson, isn't on anyone's side in this contract." Sadie calculated silently and felt the back of her neck go cold. Spring. That would fall almost exactly when her child was due. She turned back to the first page and read it once more, while Pierce poured another cup of tea, speaking idly in the polite tone of a man filling an uncomfortable silence. "I should also mention that your file reached us in unusually complete condition. Debt records, medical records, everything neatly arranged. It is rare for a matter like this to proceed so smoothly. A stroke of good fortune within misfortune, one might say." Sadie only nodded faintly, her thoughts still caught on the line about the room overlooking the sea. She thought of Toby and the criminal record hanging over his head at 19. She thought of the child in her womb, who would grow up beneath the weight of debt before ever knowing the face of its father. But when she accepted the pen Pierce offered, heavy and cold as an oath, what rose before her mind wasn't any debt at all. It was the image of her mother sitting beside a window overlooking the ocean, cared for by gentle hands for the rest of her life, whether or not she still remembered who she was. Sadie Lawson signed her name at the bottom of the page, the line of ink steady and unbroken, and somewhere north of the city, inside a gray stone mansion she had never seen, her fate had already turned to a new page before the ink had even dried. The car came to collect her on a weekend morning, black and silent as the world it belonged to, and the person already waiting in the back seat was neither a bodyguard nor a lawyer, but a woman in her 50s with broad shoulders, a straight back, and salt and pepper hair pinned into a neat bun without a single loose strand. The kind of woman Sadie knew at a glance didn't merely live in a house but ran it. "I'm Bertie Doyle, housekeeper of Blackwater House," the woman said, handing her a thermos of hot tea in place of a greeting. "And if you ask anyone there, they'll tell you I also serve as the conscience of that house, because God knows it needs one." During the long drive out of the city, along the gray shoreline blurred by mist, Bertie spoke about her employer in a tone Sadie had never heard from anyone before, grumbling as though she were complaining about a stubborn grandchild, yet loyal enough to bite anyone who dared speak badly of him in her presence. "There are 3 things in this world he hates," Bertie said, tapping one finger against the thermos in rhythm. "Lies, pity, and tea brewed longer than 4 minutes. You may make the 3rd mistake once and be forgiven. I make no promises about the first 2. I held him the day he was born, Miss Lawson. I've seen him through the worst days any human being could endure, and I'll tell you what the people outside those gates will never understand. He is frightening, yes, but frightening and cruel are 2 entirely different creatures. Don't make the same mistake the rest of the world makes." Sadie was about to ask more when the road curved through a stand of ancient pines, and Blackwater House appeared before her, like a stone ship stranded beside the frozen bay. The 3-story mansion was built entirely of gray granite, its tall, narrow windows reflecting a leaden sky, its chimneys rising like the fingers of a hand keeping count, and behind it, beyond gardens buried in snow, a vast lake lay motionless beneath a sheet of cloudy white ice, bordered by bare trees standing at attention like a company of guards that had frozen to death a century ago. The first thing Sadie noticed was the main staircase, a broad structure of granite spreading before the entrance hall, flanked by 2 stone lions, the kind of staircase built to receive guests powerful enough to make an entire city bow. The second thing she realized, with a small ache in her chest, was that the car didn't stop there. It circled around the right side of the house, where a smooth, wide stone ramp sloped gently toward a side entrance hidden behind rows of low-trimmed pines, so discreet that no guest standing at the main gate could ever know it existed. The house had already told her its first truth about its owner, before he ever had the chance to speak, that this place possessed one face for the world and another path for the truth, and the 2 were never meant to meet. Inside, the corridor smelled of beeswax and cedar. The ceilings rose impossibly high, and portraits of Kavana ancestors looked down at her with the same cold gray eyes. Bertie led her through 2 oak doors into the library, where a fire burned in a stone hearth, and the man to whom she had signed away the rest of her life sat waiting beside a window overlooking the frozen lake. Connor Kavanagh was younger than she had imagined, and colder than every rumor combined. He sat in a sleek black carbon fiber wheelchair, his broad shoulders stretching beneath a white shirt without a single wrinkle, his jaw sharp as though carved from the same stone as the house, and his ash-gray eyes lifted to meet hers without blinking, the gaze of a man inspecting an item that had just been delivered, slow, thorough, and without the slightest attempt to conceal it. He didn't wheel himself forward to greet her. He didn't offer his hand. He gave no apology and no explanation for remaining where he was, and that refusal to explain told Sadie more than words ever could, that this man had stopped justifying himself to the world a very long time ago. "Ms. Lawson," he said, his voice deep and dry as aged whiskey, "you may sit or you may stand there and continue judging me for a while longer. I'm told you are skilled at both." Sadie pulled out the chair across from him, sat with her back straight, and placed both hands on her knees. "And I'm told you pay for the truth," she replied. "So here it is. "I've finished judging you. You don't look like a man who needs to buy a wife. You look like a man who needs to buy a witness." Something flashed in the depths of his gray eyes. So quickly she almost missed it, not quite a smile, but perhaps some distant relative of one. "Then the witness should hear the rules of this house clearly," he said, and began listing them in the steady voice of a man reciting business terms. "The west wing of the second floor belongs to you. No servant will enter your private rooms without permission. You may use the library, the conservatory, the gardens, and the household cars. You may go anywhere in the city, provided you inform Mackey's security team." He paused. "The east wing of the third floor is locked." "Don't ask." Sadie looked directly into his eyes. "And what rules apply to you?" she asked. "You make rules for the house and for me." "What do you bind yourself with?" This time his surprise was more visible, a brief stillness in the hand resting on the wheel rim, as though no one in the past 20 months had thought to ask him that question. "I never ask again for something you have refused once," he said slowly, laying each word down like a stone in a road. "I don't lie to you, no matter how ugly the truth may be, and in return, I ask only one thing. Never lie to me, Ms. Lawson. In this house, I can forgive a dagger. I can forgive poison. But I can't forgive a lie because a dagger can only kill a man, while a lie kills trust. And trust is the one thing I no longer possess enough of to lose again." The room fell silent, with only the crackle of burning wood in the hearth between them, and Sadie nodded, a slow gesture carrying the weight of an oath. She rose and asked permission to retire to her room, and as she passed the wheelchair, her eyes fell by accident to the hand resting on the rim, where the cuff of his white shirt revealed a dark red stain beneath the fabric at his wrist. Blood, not yet fully dry. She faltered for half a step. He saw it. He saw exactly where her gaze had landed, and Sadie waited for him to pull down his sleeve, waited for some careless explanation about a scratch suffered while working, anything people usually did, to close a door that had opened by mistake. Connor Kavanagh did nothing. He left his hand where it was, left the blood where it was, and looked back at her with calm gray eyes, as though to say, "I promised I wouldn't lie to you, and this silence is the most honest thing I have." Sadie lowered her head in farewell, and walked out of the library, hearing the heavy wooden door close behind her, and carried a question up to her new rooms that hadn't been invited, but clung to her throughout her first night, beneath that unfamiliar roof. What did that man do alone each night? Where did he go? And how badly did it hurt? For morning to leave nothing behind but blood still damp on the cuff of a white shirt he couldn't even be bothered to hide. The first week at Blackwater House passed in a silence polished to perfection, with most meals taken alone, long corridors where servants bowed before vanishing like well-trained shadows, and Sadie gradually learning the rhythm of the house. She learned that 3 rings of the bell meant visitors had arrived, that the kitchen was Bertie's inviolable territory, and that her husband, the man with whom she had exchanged barely 2 conversations since arriving, worked late into the night in the library, with men who came and went through the side entrance. That afternoon, she went looking for Bertie to ask about her prenatal appointment the following week. A servant told her the housekeeper had gone down to the cellar to fetch wine for dinner, so Sadie followed the winding stone staircase into the depths of the house, where the air grew colder and heavier, rich with the scent of oak steeped in aging wine. She had nearly reached the end of the low corridor, when voices drifted from the final room, where a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, allowing a narrow blade of yellow light to spill through. Instinct told her to stop before reason had time to intervene, because among those voices was one she recognized at once, deep, dry, never needing to rise, the voice of Connor Kavanagh. Sadie knew she should turn around and go upstairs. She remained where she was. Through the opening, she saw a broad stone-floored room, wine racks running along the walls like bookshelves in a giant's library, and in the center, beneath a low-hanging lamp, Connor sat behind a long wooden table. Mackie stood slightly behind his shoulder, with his arms folded across his chest, while on the other side of the table, a gray-haired man in work clothes twisted a wool cap between both hands, beside a younger man in a gray suit who was sweating despite the cellar being as cold as a morgue. 3 shipments, Connor said without looking at the papers before him. 3 shipments in 2 months. Nearly $100,000 in losses. Every one of them passed through Warehouse 7. Every one of them during your shift, Mr. Farrell. The gray-haired man swallowed, then raised his head with the resolve of someone who had rehearsed his answer all night. Sir, It was me. I took the goods. I sold them outside. I accept full responsibility. I only ask that you leave my family out of it." The seller became utterly still, and from the doorway Sadie watched Connor lean back, lace his fingers together, and tilt his head slightly, studying the man before him for so long that Farrell began to tremble. "Mr. Farrell," Connor finally said, his voice never changing in pitch, "you have worked at my family's docks for 23 years. My father once said you were the only man he trusted with a warehouse key, without counting the inventory afterward. A man like that doesn't suddenly become a thief at 58. You are holding that cap as though it were something else. I suspect you are holding it in place of a name. Your son, isn't it? The boy is in his 20s. He left his job at the ship repair yard last fall, and the people he owes money to aren't the kind of creditors who keep offices." The man named Farrell collapsed, as though someone had pulled the spine from his body. His shoulders shook, and the real confession spilled out in broken, disordered fragments. His son's addiction. The nights he had searched abandoned buildings for him. The shipments he had moved outside the docks to pay the boy's debts, because he was afraid they would hurt him. Sadie held her breath behind the door, one hand unconsciously resting on her stomach, and waited for the sentence. Connor remained silent for a long time before speaking, his voice still level, though something had shifted beneath the surface. "You stole from me, Farrell. That is the truth, and the truth has a price. You will work without pay for 6 months until every dollar has been returned. But you didn't lie when I asked you directly. You only tried to place yourself between your child and the danger coming for him, and that is a crime I can't judge, because someone once stood in front of me in exactly the same way. Bring the boy to Mackie tomorrow morning. There is a good rehabilitation center outside Portland. The family will cover the cost. If he runs from it, you lose your job. If he stays for 12 months, I will consider the matter of Warehouse 7 as though it never happened." Farrell let out a strangled sob and began stammering words of gratitude, but Connor had already turned toward the man in the gray suit, who stood frozen in place, and the temperature in his voice dropped below even the cold of the stone cellar. "As for you, Quinn, assistant port manager, you signed off on 3 inventory reports stating that Warehouse 7 wasn't missing a single crate. You knew what Farrell was doing from the first shipment. You kept that knowledge as leverage, intending to use it when you wanted his position. And when I asked you last week, you looked me in the eye and told me everything at the docks was in order." The man named Quinn opened his mouth, and excuses poured from him like water through a broken dam. He claimed it had been an oversight, that the reports had been prepared by subordinates, and Connor allowed him to speak until he had nothing left, patient as someone waiting for a clock to spend the final turn of its spring. Then Connor drew a phone from the inside pocket of his coat, pressed a number already stored there, and the call lasted no more than 15 seconds. "Declan, it's me. That man Quinn you asked about last week for the Baltimore Port Partnership. Remove his name, and tell Commonwealth Prosperity Bank that I'm no longer backing his mortgage. Thank you." He put the phone away and looked at the pale man before him, with the expression one might reserve for something already broken. "Beginning tomorrow morning, you won't be able to find work loading cargo anywhere from Boston to Baltimore. The bank will call in your home loan before its term, and the yacht club where you buy drinks every Friday night will have forgotten your name before the weekend is over. You lied to me to keep your chair, Quinn, so I am taking away everything that chair ever bought you. You may keep exactly one thing, the lesson." Mackie led both men out through the rear door, and Sadie stepped back from the opening, her heart pounding, then quietly made her way up the stone staircase through the darkness. That night, she lay listening to the wind from the bay scrape across the window panes and rearranged in her mind the man she had married, a man capable of erasing someone from society with a phone call shorter than the time it took to pour a cup of tea, without raising his voice and without spilling a drop of blood. And yet the same man had spared a father who stole because he had dared to stand between danger and his child. She realized she was afraid of Connor, afraid of him in the way people feared the deep sea. But mingled with that fear was something she hadn't expected. Those dark waters had roots, they had laws, and every law was carved from a single word, truth. What she didn't yet know, as she pulled the blanket higher and listened to the stone house breathe evenly through the night, was that one day she herself would stand at the very center of that law, where a lie and a hidden truth were separated by no more than a single heartbeat. The presentation banquet took place on a Saturday afternoon near the end of winter, in the grand dining room of Blackwater House, where candles burned along a wooden table long enough to seat 20 people, and firelight danced across sets of silver cutlery that Sadie suspected were worth more than 5 years of her wages as a waitress. There was no white wedding dress, no shower of flowers, no vows before the altar of God, only a stack of documents resting on a silver tray, 2 fountain pens, and 8 silver-haired men representing the Council of Families, seated along both sides of the table like 8 judges who had come to witness a sentence rather than a marriage. Sadie wore the simplest smoke-gray wool dress Bertie had prepared for her hair gathered in a low bun, and she entered the room beneath 16 eyes measuring every inch of her, gazes that made no effort to hide why they had come. They wanted to see what Boston's wheelchair-bound kingpin had managed to acquire: a pregnant waitress, a pawn, a joke, or a calamity. Connor sat at the head of the table in a black shirt, offering no elaborate introduction. He merely stated that this was his wife, Sadie Lawson, soon to be Sadie Kavanagh, and that the papers were ready for those appointed by the council to serve as witnesses. The seals were ratified. Congratulations were exchanged in polished phrases worn smooth over 3 generations, and then dinner began. The servants moved around the table as quietly as water, and Sadie sat in the place reserved for the mistress of the house, facing her husband across the full length of the table, acutely aware of every scrutinizing gaze that followed each movement of her hands. They were waiting for her to choose the wrong fork, waiting for her to falter before a rule no one had taught her, waiting for her to reveal the humble origins they had already judged before she ever entered the room. The wine steward made his way around the table with the practiced ease of a man trained through 100 formal dinners, pouring dark red wine, rich as velvet, into every crystal glass. When he stopped at Sadie's right and tilted the bottle, the wine flowed into her glass before she had time to speak, and the entire table seemed to sink into a faint but unmistakable pause, the silence of predators sensing that their prey was about to make its first mistake. Everyone there could see the bride's rounded waist, and everyone wanted to know how she would respond, whether she would drink to please the table or refuse and embarrass the man pouring. Sadie looked at the glass for 1 second, then calmly lifted it with 2 fingers, set it in the empty place beside her, and looked up at the wine steward with the relieved smile of someone ordering at a familiar diner. "My daughter isn't old enough to drink this yet. Would you please bring her a glass of warm milk? She is still growing." A stunned second descended over the long table. All 8 elders froze in the middle of their movements, and then from the far end came a sound that no one in the room, not even those who had served the Kavanagh family for 3 generations, could remember hearing before. Connor Kavanagh laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and resonant, bursting from his chest like something that had escaped a prison where it had been confined for 20 months. In the corner of the room, Bertie Doyle dropped a silver spoon onto her tray, and the bright clatter of metal disappeared beneath the laughter of the man she had held in her arms on the first day of his life. That laugh accomplished what no ceremony could. It broke the atmosphere of judgment cleanly in half. Several elders found themselves laughing with him before they even realized it. The wine steward bowed and went to fetch the milk, his ears reddening while the corners of his mouth curved upward. The oldest elder at the table, an old gentleman with eyebrows as white as 2 streaks of snow, raised his glass towards Sadie and said that in 40 years of attending dinners in their world, this was the first time he had seen a bride establish a new rule at her very first banquet. "And daughter," he added. "You heard her clearly, Connor." She said daughter. "The Kavanagh family is about to have a little lady." Sadie merely smiled and sipped the warm milk delivered on a silver tray, as though it were the finest wine of the evening. Beneath the table, however, one hand rested lightly on her stomach. She didn't look toward the far end of the room, and she didn't need to, because she could feel those gray eyes resting on her throughout the remainder of dinner. It was no longer the assessing gaze he had given her during their first meeting in the library, but something more attentive, something warmer, as though the man at the head of the table had just discovered that the possession he had purchased could walk on its own and knew how to bite. The dinner ended late. One black car after another departed from the front drive, and Sadie returned to her rooms in the West Wing as the clock struck 11, but sleep wouldn't come. Part of it was the baby kicking softly, as though she too still carried the excitement of the evening, and part of it was that the room remained too unfamiliar for Sadie's body to surrender itself completely. Sometime after midnight, she put on her robe and rose to fetch water. In the long corridor leading toward the staircase, beside a small brass wastebasket near a console table, her eyes caught on something lying at the top. It was a roll of used medical gauze, stained with dark red streaks that hadn't yet turned brown. She stood looking at it for the length of a single breath, then continued walking. It wasn't until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, while she lay awake in the darkness, that she heard the familiar sound of wheelchair wheels moving very slowly and quietly through the entrance hall below, like someone trying to return to his room without waking his own pain. But that wasn't the strangest thing about that night. The following morning, when the first sunlight pierced the narrow windows, and Sadie came downstairs earlier than usual, she took a wrong turn in the house, whose passages she had not yet fully learned, and found herself standing at the foot of the staircase, leading to the east wing of the 3rd floor, where the rules of the house forbade her to go. She didn't climb the stairs. She meant only to turn away, but a flash of light above caught her eye. The morning sun was striking the brass lock on the door at the top of the staircase, an old lock covered in the green corrosion of many untouched years. Yet against that dark layer of rust around the mouth of the keyhole were small, thin scratches that gleamed with the brightness of freshly exposed metal. Sadie stood there in the early sunlight as a cold current traveled slowly down her spine, because those scratches couldn't have been more than a few days old. It meant that inside the house where everyone bowed their heads and obeyed Connor Kavanagh's laws, someone was quietly and patiently trying to open the door to the room the dead had left behind. Sadie kept the scratches around the lock to herself, quietly storing them away as she might record an unfamiliar number in a ledger, because she understood that suspicion without proof wasn't yet worth placing on the table of a man the whole world was already watching for weakness. Instead, she turned to the work her hands had known how to do best, since the days when she helped her mother count every grocery penny. She read the accounts. No one assigned her the task, but the mistress of Blackwater House had the right to inspect the household expenses, and Sadie spent an entire week of sleet and rain in the library with the leather-bound ledgers, checking every column of numbers with the patience of a woman who had once counted loose tips at the end of every night. What she discovered kept her awake for another 2 weeks, while she gathered enough courage to speak. That morning, she came down to the dining room early, placed the ledger beside Connor's coffee tray, opened it to the page she had marked, and spoke before fear had time to catch up with her. "Sir, this house is burning money to heat 11 rooms no one has entered in nearly 2 years, while the dockworkers' housing, property belonging to the family itself, has roofs that leak so badly people have to set out buckets every time the snow melts." I reviewed the maintenance reports. Repairing the entire housing block would cost less than the coal and firewood those empty rooms consume in a single winter. She stood straight and waited for the storm, waited for him to ask who had given her permission to search through the books, waited for the voice as cold as the stone cellar she had heard that day. Connor merely pulled the ledger closer, scanned the lines she had marked in pencil, tapped his forefinger twice against the edge of the table, and said simply, "Fix it. Tell Mackie to use the dock crews and have it finished this month. Give priority to homes with children and the elderly." Sadie stood there, momentarily stunned, and when he looked up and caught the bewilderment on her face, one corner of his mouth lifted by half a fraction. "What is it? You had a defense prepared, didn't you?" "3, she admitted. "Then you wasted your time writing them," he said, returning to his coffee. "I didn't marry a decoration that happens to breathe. The next time you find a flaw in my accounts, bring it straight to the breakfast table. Don't spend 2 weeks gathering courage. I pay for the truth, not for people creeping around it." From that morning on, something began to shift very slowly between the two strangers living beneath the same roof, not through grand declarations, but through things so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. The following week, they rode together to the harbor to inspect the repairs on the workers' housing. The road along the frozen bay was rough and uneven, and each time the car struck a crack, Sadie saw the man beside her tighten his jaw by the slightest degree. his knuckles whitening against the armrest as pain was swallowed before it could become sound. She didn't ask whether he was all right. She knew the question would earn her nothing but the words, "I'm fine," and a door slamming shut. Instead, she leaned forward, turned the heater to its highest setting, aimed the vents toward his seat, then rubbed her hands together and complained that the cold in this place sank too deeply into her bones, and that she hoped he wouldn't mind sitting in a little extra heat because she had no intention of sharing winter with anyone. Connor looked at her for a second longer than necessary, long enough for her to know he saw straight through the clumsy lie, but he didn't expose it. He only gave a slight nod and turned toward the window, and for the rest of the drive warm air flowed steadily over his motionless knees without either of them having to name the reason. Then came the evening when the family received a retired judge. Sadie stood before the mirror in the small dressing room beside the hall, struggling with the clasp of the pearl necklace Bertie had given her. Her fingers, stiff from the cold, kept slipping over the tiny fastening, and she didn't hear the wheelchair moving across the carpet until Connor's low voice sounded behind her. "Let me." He rolled closer and took both ends of the necklace from her hands, and Sadie stood still, holding her breath, as those unexpectedly warm fingers worked behind her neck, slowly and carefully, with a precision that seemed strangely out of place in a man who did everything else in life with the speed of a falling blade. "Done," he said, but his thumb lingered for half a second against the skin at the nape of her neck, directly above the pulse she couldn't possibly hide. When she turned to thank him, he added in a voice lower than usual, "My mother was ill in her final years. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't fasten a single button by herself. I learned to do this for her when I was 16. This is the first time I've used that skill since." He rolled away before Sadie could answer, leaving her alone in the middle of the room, with the warmth still resting at the back of her neck, and a fragment of his past placed quietly in her hands without being asked for. The first piece he had given willingly, and she understood what it had cost him. But the moment that changed everything came late one afternoon at the end of that week, when she entered the library to return a book and found him sitting motionless beside the desk, holding the silver picture frame that usually lay face down against the wood. Now it stood upright beneath the lamplight. Two young men were pictured on the deck of a yacht, the sunlight in the photograph bright and golden. The man on the left was Connor from another life, laughing, while the man on the right had the same gray eyes, but warmer and younger, with one arm draped around his older brother's shoulders. "That was Brendan," Connor said without turning around, as though he had heard her footsteps beyond the door and had decided not to hide this time. "My younger brother. 4 years younger than me, better than I was at every decent thing in this world. I was supposed to drive that night, but I said I had a migraine, and he laughed and told me the eldest son should stay behind signing papers while someone who knew how to live did the driving. Then he took my seat." He stopped, and his throat moved once. "That bomb was meant for me, do you understand? That seat, that hour, that road, every part of it had been calculated for me, and my brother paid the entire price in my place." The room grew so quiet that they could hear the snow scraping against the glass. Sadie crossed the space between them before she had time to decide, and her hand came to rest over his, clenched tightly against the side of the chair, a touch as light as a condolence for which no words existed. Connor jerked his hand away with such speed and force that it was as though her skin had burned him. The wheelchair rolled back half a turn, and when he spoke his voice was low and rough as stone against a blade. "Don't touch me out of pity. I can swallow anything in this world except that." Sadie didn't step back. She didn't apologize. She remained exactly where she was and held his gaze with all the calm she possessed. "I didn't touch you out of pity," she said, each word clear and deliberate. "I touched you because you had just told me a painful truth, and people call that respect, Mr. Kavanagh. Those are two different things, and you should begin learning the difference, because I intend to remain in this house long enough to give you plenty of opportunities to practice." Connor looked at her for a very long time. Something naked and bewildered passed through the depths of his gray eyes before he gathered it away as carefully as he always did. He said nothing more. He didn't apologize. He didn't nod. He only placed the silver frame back on the desk in silence. But this time, when Sadie closed the library door behind her, she noticed that he had left it standing upright, facing the lamplight, instead of turning it face down as he had for the past 20 months. That night, the wind shifted, carrying in from the bay a thin whistle through the gaps in the old windows, and Sadie lay awake in the darkness of the west wing with one hand resting on her stomach, listening to the stone house tell its midnight stories, the wood contracting in the cold, the fire downstairs slowly dying, the grandfather clock in the entrance hall striking 2 o'clock in an aged brass voice. She had nearly slipped into sleep when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the familiar music of the house, something dragging slowly along the corridor outside, heavy and uneven, broken by the restrained breathing of someone struggling in silence. And then, without warning, a deep, weighty crash reverberated through the wall, the sound of a human body striking the wooden floor. Sadie sat upright before her mind had time to name what was happening. Her bare feet touched the cold floor. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and her hand was already on the doorknob, already turning it halfway, when she heard the second sound, and it was that sound that held her still. It wasn't a call. It wasn't a groan. It was breathing, harsh and furious, the breathing of a man fighting alone on the floor beyond her door, a man who would rather bite through his own lip than let a cry for help escape. And in that moment, with her hand still resting on the knob, Sadie understood with an instinct sharper than reason that if she opened the door, she would save him from the floor, but destroy the last thing he still possessed for himself, the right to fall without anyone witnessing it. That man had been watched by the entire city because of his wheelchair, examined by the council for every sign of weakness, and forced to build a separate entrance into his own home, to shield himself from the eyes of others. He had no place left in the world where he was allowed to fail in private, except that dark corridor at 2 o'clock in the morning. So Sadie did the hardest thing she had ever done, harder even than signing the marriage contract. She remained still. She pressed her entire palm against the cold wood of the door, rested her forehead against it, and stood in the darkness, listening to every movement on the other side, the sound of bare arms sliding across the floor in search of leverage, the groan of the wheelchair's metal frame being dragged closer, the effort ground down between clenched teeth, one slip, one furious hand striking the floor, then another attempt, slower this time, more stubborn. Inside her, the baby gave one small kick and then went quiet, as though she too were holding her breath with her mother. Sadie stood there without knowing how long, until the breathing on the other side became steady again, until the wheels finally began to move, slowly receding toward the far end of the corridor. Only when the sound had disappeared completely into the heart of the house did she allow her knees to give way beside the door, and only then did she allow the tears to come, silent and hot, crying for a man so proud that he would rather crawl across the floor of his own home than knock once on a door with someone waiting directly behind it. The next morning, she entered the dining room and found him there before his usual hour. No reports lay open in front of him. There was no coffee. His face was gray with exhaustion, and something in the way he sat was drawn as tight as a string about to snap. He didn't greet her or prepare the ground. He simply spoke into the space between them. "You heard me last night." It wasn't a question, so Sadie didn't answer it as one. She pulled out a chair, sat down, poured herself tea with steady hands, and replied, "Yes, I heard." "Then you also understand why this has to end," Connor said, his voice flat and cold as the lake outside. "I'll have Pierce redraft the papers. Every benefit promised to you will remain unchanged, complete, and lifelong. You may return to the city this week." This arrangement was a mistake from the beginning. Sadie set down her teacup slowly. The faint sound of porcelain touching porcelain rang through the silent room, and she said a single word. "No." Connor blinked, as though in every scenario he had constructed through the night, that answer had never existed. "What did you say?" "I said no, sir." "I'm not going anywhere," Sadie repeated, calmly meeting the gray eyes that had darkened before her. "You fell last night. I heard it. And that changes nothing about the way I see you, except that it confirms something I've suspected for a long time. That you are so stubborn you would rather crawl across the floor than call out to the person standing directly behind the door." His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, the frozen shell cracked just enough to reveal what lay beneath it, tired and exposed. "You don't understand. Most people can't bear to watch a man fail. They say it doesn't matter, and then their eyes change, one by one. I've seen the entire collection of those changed looks. I don't need yours added to it. I didn't watch," Sadie said, letting each word fall slowly between them, like stones laid into a road. I waited. You were on the floor on the other side of the wall, and I stood on this side with my hand against the door the entire time, waiting for a call I knew would never come. Watching and waiting are two different things, Mr. Kavanagh. One takes dignity away from the person who has fallen. The other protects it, and I think it is time someone taught you the difference. Just as I told you about pity and respect. The room sank into silence for a long time. Connor looked at her as though she were a problem that refused to obey any law he understood, and at last he turned his face toward the window overlooking the frozen lake. His voice lowered, almost as though he were speaking to himself rather than to her. Do you know what the funniest part is? For 20 months, I never once asked why I wasn't getting better. I took the medicine, I did the exercises. Yet my strength kept slipping through my hands like sand, and I never questioned it, because somewhere in my mind, I thought that was how it should be. Brendan paid with his entire life, so I would pay with my legs and nights like last night. It seemed only fair that I make payments on my share. Sadie heard those words, and something pierced her chest, sharp and deep, not because of the pain in them, but because of the calm with which he spoke. This man had sentenced himself 20 months ago and had obediently carried out that sentence every day without filing a single appeal. She offered no words of comfort. She knew he would throw them aside like an unnecessary blanket. Instead, she rose, walked around the table, filled the empty coffee cup before him as though it were the most ordinary part of every morning, then spoke in the voice of someone closing the books at the end of the day. Then this is the arrangement, sir. You may continue paying a debt no one has asked you to repay if that is what you choose. As for me, I will remain here, behind my door, and wait until the day you realize that some sentences exist, only because the prisoner refuses to walk out of a cell whose lock is already open. She left the dining room without waiting for an answer, and Connor Kavanagh remained there alone for a very long time beside the steaming cup of coffee, not drinking it, only staring at it, as though somewhere within that fragile ribbon of rising steam was something he had forgotten how to name. From that morning onward, no one in the house ever heard the master mention redrafting the papers or sending a car back to the city again. The following Wednesday morning, disaster nearly struck on the side ramp of the mansion, where Connor descended each day to reach the car waiting to take him to meetings at the harbor office, and Sadie witnessed everything from the dining room window. The wheelchair had just entered the sloping section when it suddenly picked up speed in a way that wasn't natural. Connor gripped the wheel rims with both hands, but the momentum didn't lessen. The entire chair lurched toward the left, where the ramp met the stone steps, and in the split second when Sadie's heart stopped, Mackie, who had been waiting beside the car door, charged forward 3 steps with a speed no one would have expected from a man in his 40s, seized the frame with both hands, and brought it to a violent halt no more than a handspan from the edge. In the courtyard, everything returned to order with frightening speed. Connor waved away concern and said he was fine. Mackie silently inspected the chair. Then the two men exchanged a long, wordless look, and the car still rolled through the gates on time as though nothing had happened. But Sadie had abandoned her breakfast without realizing it, and that afternoon, when a spare wheelchair was brought into use, and the other was taken to the storage building to await a mechanic, she asked Bertie for the key under the pretense of retrieving a forgotten shawl. Alone in the slanting afternoon light, she knelt beside the chair and traced the braking system with her fingers, just as she had once followed every torn seam in Toby's clothes so she could mend it. She found it on the left brake cable, hidden beneath the wheel axle in a place ordinary use could never have touched. The cable hadn't snapped with the frayed, uneven break of fatigued metal. It had been cut, a clean, smooth incision running almost entirely through it, leaving only a few thin strands of steel, just enough for the brake to function normally for several more days, before betraying its owner in the most dangerous place possible. Sadie remained motionless beside the chair for a long time, machine grease staining her hand, the cold of the storage building seeping through her wool dress without her noticing, because her entire mind had been overtaken by one simple and horrifying truth. Someone had knelt in the exact place where she was kneeling, with a blade in hand and enough knowledge of that chair to know precisely where to cut. That person moved freely through Blackwater House, and the scratches around the lock on the 3rd floor were no longer an idle question. That evening, she told Connor everything without preamble, describing the cut with the precision of someone who had worked with kitchen knives all her life. He listened to the end without changing a single line of his face, then asked only one question. "Does anyone else know?" When she shook her head, he nodded. "Keep it that way. Tell no one, not even Bertie. The council session is only a few weeks away, and a family head being attacked inside his own home would be the finest gift I could offer those trying to prove I no longer control even my own grounds. I need whoever did this to believe we think it was an accident. A hunter only reveals himself when he believes the prey hasn't caught the scent of the trap." Sadie wanted to argue. She wanted to say that his life mattered more than any council session, but when she looked into his eyes, she understood that this wasn't carelessness. It was the move of a man who had been playing this deadly game far longer than she had. So she only nodded and carried the secret inside her, like a stone lodged in her chest. The stone had barely had time to cool before the visitor arrived 3 days later. A slate-gray sports car glided into the front courtyard like a blade passing over silk, and the man who stepped out carried a kind of brightness Sadie distrusted at once. He was tall and handsome, with the flawless beauty of someone carefully maintained. His smile forming before its owner had even properly seen the person before him. Desmond Kavanagh, Connor's cousin and second in command, a man Bertie introduced through clenched teeth with one sentence. Young Mr. Desmond has come without warning, as usual. He kissed Sadie's hand in the old-fashioned manner, praised how much warmer the house had become since acquiring a mistress, and asked after her health with concern, tailored so precisely it might have been measured and sewn for the occasion. Throughout afternoon tea, he spoke with the effortless charm of a practiced host, but Sadie, who had learned through 7 years of waiting tables that a person's hands were more truthful than their mouth, never stopped watching his right hand, where a silver lighter turned continuously between his long fingers, turning, stopping, turning again with the steady rhythm of a metronome, even though he never lit a single cigarette. His opportunity came when Bertie was summoned to the kitchen, and the two of them were left alone beside the window overlooking the frozen lake. Desmond lowered his voice into the warm register of private concern. "Sadie, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but family must look after one another, and you are family now. My cousin is a great man in his own way, but you should also understand what this marriage was born from. The council needed to see an heir. The papers needed a name. Every part of it was a necessary move. I only worry about you." He paused with perfect calculation, turned the lighter once more, then lowered the honey-coated blade in a voice as smooth as velvet. "A child with no Kavanagh blood, given the Kavanagh name because of a contract. Have you ever wondered what will happen on the day she is born, when the papers are complete and the council has given its approval? What kind of eyes will he use to look at her? The eyes of a father, or the eyes of a man who has finished signing a contract and sees no reason to read it again?" The question struck the softest place in Sadie's chest, the very fear she had hidden beneath every layer of courage, and for 1 second she nearly allowed it to show on her face. But 7 years of serving tables had also taught her how to hold a smile while being insulted. So she turned and looked directly into the eyes, waiting for her reaction, then answered in a tone as light as though they were discussing the weather. "Mr. Desmond, I spent 7 years working as a waitress, and I learned one thing. Never guess what a customer wants before they order. People are wrong far too often, especially when they are guessing about someone else's heart. As for my daughter, she doesn't need anyone to look at her in any particular way. She already has me looking at her with my entire life. That is enough capital for her to grow on. Anything more, should it come, will be profit, and I imagine the Kavanagh family understands profit better than I do." Desmond's smile didn't falter. He even gave a soft laugh and praised his sister-in-law for her sharpness, but Sadie saw it, a flash that appeared and vanished behind his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a chess player who had just discovered that the piece before him could move on its own and was quietly recalculating his next move. The silver lighter turned exactly once more in his hand, then became still. He left before dinner, embracing Connor by the shoulder, with easy affection in the entrance hall, and promising to see him at the council session, and the house closed its doors behind him, the way one might close a door after an unfamiliar wind had passed through. At the end of that week, according to arrangements made earlier by Dr. Hale, A young private nurse moved into the mansion to oversee the mistress's pregnancy. Kayla Bennett was 24, gentle and careful in her work, with a temperament so mild she was almost transparent. But Sadie, who had learned to notice the smallest things, soon began to recognize details that didn't fit. The way Kayla always lowered her eyes whenever anyone asked about her family. She occasionally asked questions beyond the boundaries of her duties with such casual ease. Was the mistress going out today? On which day of the week did the mistress usually send her correspondence? Had the master been sleeping well lately? Each question alone was as harmless as a glass of water, but when arranged side by side inside a house where a brake cable had been cut and a lock had been partially forced, they began to resemble small stones someone was quietly laying into a path. Sadie decided not to question her, not to expose her, only to remember, as her father had taught her while he was still alive, that if you wanted to know where the water was flowing, you shouldn't block the current. You should set a leaf upon it and watch in silence. The leaf Sadie set upon the current wasn't Kayla, but a bottle of medicine, because of all the things that didn't fit inside Blackwater House. The one that troubled her most persistently was the faint scent that drifted through the side kitchen each evening when Dr. Warren Hale, the physician, who had cared for Connor since the explosion and had treated his father before him, prepared the master's nightly medication. It was a sharp, cloyingly sweet odor hidden beneath the smell of herbs, so faint that most people would have ignored it. But Sadie's sense of smell had stored it in a chamber of memory that never locked, because it was the same scent that had clung to her father's room during the final months of his life, when the medicine prescribed for him had turned a ship mechanic, who once knew every bolt in a marine engine by heart, into a confused, sluggish man who slept more than he woke, fading first in the mind before his heart finally surrendered. She used the excuse of helping clear the tray to study the brown glass bottles more closely. None bore a commercial label, only the doctor's hurried handwriting, and one afternoon, when Hale caught her standing a little too long beside the medicine tray, he gave her the smile adults reserved for children and said in a sugar-coated voice, "Madam, you needn't concern yourself with these matters. Medicine belongs to those with professional training." When Sadie asked him directly whether such a regular dose of sedatives might be the reason Mr. Kavanagh was always exhausted, his smile cooled by several degrees. "Madam, I was treating this family before you were born. Absolute rest is the only path remaining for those legs, and I would advise a young wife not to practice medicine by instinct." The remark had been designed to close a door, but instead it opened another inside Sadie. She returned to her room, sat for a long time beside the window with her hands clasped together, and quietly spoke aloud the words she had never told anyone in that house. "I was once accepted into nursing school, doctor. Life didn't allow me to wear that white uniform, but it forgot to take away my nose and my hands. She needed a path around him, one that was discreet and lawful, and that path led to a name she had heard Bertie mention with rare respect, Noelle Whitmore. An attorney, and the woman who had once worn Connor Kavanagh's engagement ring before the explosion. Sadie arranged to meet her at a small tea shop in the city, prepared to face a rival, but the 31-year-old woman with neatly swept brown hair took Sadie's hand between both of her warm palms, ordered chamomile tea for the pregnant woman before she could open the menu, and listened to the entire story of the unlabeled medicine, with her brows drawing closer together with every detail. "I know an independent doctor, discreet and owing nothing to anyone in Boston," Noelle said near the end of their meeting. "I'll arrange an examination under the pretext of a routine insurance consultation. Leave the paperwork to me. But before you go, Sadie, let me tell you something outside the law. You will need it more than any test result." She turned her teacup slowly between her hands, her eyes resting on the snowfall beyond the window. "That man has one condition no medicine can cure. He always drives people away first. Always. That way, leaving remains his decision rather than theirs. Years ago, I went because I believed it was what he wanted. Only much later did I understand it was merely what he feared. So if there comes a day when he opens the door and tells you to leave, look carefully, because that may be the day he needs you to stay most." The examination passed without incident 3 days later. The independent physician left the mansion carrying a case of samples, and 1 week after that, the results reached Sadie through Noelle's office. She read the printed lines again and again until she knew them by heart. The level of sedative in the patient's blood was many times higher than necessary for any reasonable pain management protocol, sufficient to cause prolonged mental clouding, muscular fatigue, and dependency. More significantly, the neurological reflexes in the lower limbs indicated that the damage was incomplete, and the actual potential for recovery might be substantially better than the existing medical records suggested. Sadie carried the paper into the library that evening and placed it before Connor. His anger arrived exactly as she had expected, cold, immediate, and aimed directly at her. "What have you done?" "A strange doctor in my house, testing my blood behind my back." "My medication isn't your concern, madam. You have crossed far beyond the boundaries of our contract." Sadie didn't step back. Before entering the room, she had already decided that tonight she wouldn't retreat. "I crossed a boundary." "Yes," she said, her voice never rising but refusing to yield an inch. "Then look down at that paper and tell me who crossed first. For 20 months you have swallowed a nightly dose strong enough to cloud the mind of a healthy man. For 20 months you believed that exhaustion was part of your punishment. But if obeying your doctor is what has made you weaker with every passing day, then this isn't treatment anymore, Mr. Kavanagh. It is surrender by prescription. And let me make one thing perfectly clear. I didn't sign a marriage contract with a man who surrenders." She set the test results neatly on the desk and walked out of the library. For the next 2 days, Blackwater House endured a second winter beneath its own roof. They met at the dining table with perfectly proper greetings and silences that lasted longer than the meals. Bertie moved between the two battle lines, wearing the expression of a woman who had witnessed enough storms to know that every storm eventually broke. On the third night, sleep began to fall, and Sadie found him in the conservatory, sitting motionless amid warm, damp air scented with soil and fern leaves, listening to the wet snow tap steadily against the dark glass roof. He didn't order her to leave, and in the language of that house, she understood that this was already an invitation. "I had those results checked in 2 other places," he said after a long while without turning toward her. "Both confirmed them, and I owe you a truth I have never told anyone." He paused, his fingers moving slowly over the wheel rim. "Noelle, the woman who arranged the doctor for you, was once my fiancée. The entire city believes she left me after the explosion. I allowed them to believe it. The truth is that one afternoon, I overheard her mother what kind of life her daughter would have left if she married a man like me. I didn't wait to hear Noelle's answer. I returned the ring that same week. I decided for her before she could decide for herself, because I would rather close the door with my own hand than sit there waiting for someone to walk through it and shut it behind them." The sleet continued tapping against the glass, steady and patient, and Sadie said nothing. She didn't analyze him. She didn't comfort him. She simply stepped forward and stood beside the wheelchair, extending one hand into the space between them, her palm open and facing upward, asking no one, asking for nothing, merely remaining there, an offer without terms, and she stood that way with the patience of someone who had once waited behind a closed door. 1 second passed, then 10, then longer still, long enough for a proud man to finish the final battle with himself. Then, slowly, as though he had to cross all 20 months to cover a single handspan, Connor Kavanagh lifted his hand from the wheel rim and placed it in her palm. His warm fingers closed around hers, and Sadie stood motionless in the mist-filled conservatory, listening to the beat of her own heart, understanding that of all the touches they had shared, the ones she had offered and he had withdrawn from, this was the first, the very first, that he had chosen for himself. After the night in the conservatory, Connor's medication regimen was quietly adjusted under the supervision of the independent doctor, while outwardly Hale remained listed as the physician in charge, so no one would be alerted. Day by day, like mist lifting from the surface of the lake, clarity returned to the man. He could work longer without tiring, his eyes were brighter in the evenings, and he began to notice things that 20 months of fog had hidden from him, including one very small detail about his wife. Every Sunday after lunch, Sadie disappeared from the mansion until dusk. It happened every week, as faithfully as the tide. She took the bus from town instead of one of the household cars, even though he had instructed Mackie's team to remain available to her, and when she returned, she carried herself with carefully preserved normalcy. Only her eyes betrayed her, the rims still pink from recent tears after she had already washed her face. Week after week, she offered no explanation, and Connor didn't ask. because his rule was never to ask again about something a person had chosen not to say. But not asking didn't mean he had no need to know, especially for a man who had recently discovered that the brake cable on his wheelchair had been cut and understood that any repeated route could become a danger. That Sunday, when the silver bus pulled away from the station, a black car followed at a distance of 300 yards, and Connor sat in the back seat, silently watching through the window clouded by the cold, telling himself this was a security check, nothing more than security, though some part of him knew he was lying, and he had always despised liars. The bus stopped at the edge of a small town 40 minutes outside Boston, in front of a 2-story brick building tucked behind a row of bare maple trees. A white painted wooden sign read Cedar Point Care Home. The convoy of black cars occupied one corner of the parking lot, while 2 guards went inside to inspect the corridors according to procedure, before their employer entered any unfamiliar building, because the power of the Kavanaugh family didn't rest on Sundays. It merely learned to wait outside the door. Connor stopped his wheelchair in a hidden stretch of hallway, where a broad glass window looked into a common room, flooded with afternoon sunlight, and through that glass he saw his wife. Sadie sat in a wicker chair beside a silver-haired woman in a pale blue sweater. Her face carried features that revealed in a single glance where Sadie had inherited her eyes. The woman was speaking animatedly, her wrinkled hands moving gently with the story, while Sadie listened, nodded, laughed in all the right places, poured orange juice into a plastic cup, and adjusted the light blanket across the woman's knees, with the practiced tenderness of a professional caregiver. Connor had already begun to turn away, already reproaching himself for following her to an ordinary visit with her mother, when the nurse on duty passed by, nodded to him, and casually said something that shattered the scene beyond the glass and reshaped it entirely. "She comes faithfully every week, and she has for years. Poor thing, the old lady doesn't recognize her daughter anymore. She thinks she is one of the nurses here." Connor turned back toward the glass, and this time he saw everything he hadn't seen before. He saw the old woman suddenly clutch Sadie's wrist with the pleading desperation of a child. He saw her lips form a question, and even through the glass, he could read every word from the familiar movements of their native tongue. "Miss, you work here, don't you? Do you know where my Sadie is? Why hasn't she come to visit me in so long? Is she very busy? Please tell her that her mother misses her." He saw Sadie's shoulders freeze for exactly half a second, only half a second, and then she smiled. A whole and flawless smile without a single crack. She brushed a loose strand of silver hair from the woman's forehead and answered in a voice he couldn't hear but could clearly read. "Sadie will be here soon, Mom. She asked me to tell you that she loves you very much. She loves you more than anything." The old woman brightened like a child receiving a gift, nodded happily, and returned to her cup of orange juice, while the woman sitting beside her, nearly 8 months pregnant, bent over the old photographs spread across the table and rearranged them for longer than necessary, long enough to blink several times before lifting her head with the same smile still perfectly in place. Connor Kavanaugh had sat through judgments of life and death. He had watched enemies scream and loved ones fall, yet nothing in the past 20 months had pressed against his chest with the weight of that half-second hesitation in Sadie's shoulders. He remained motionless in the hidden corridor until the visit ended, watching his wife complete the entire role of a kind stranger before the woman who had given birth to her. For a week no one could count anymore. Then ordered the cars to leave first, so she wouldn't know she had been seen. But he couldn't keep the knowledge to himself until the end. Late that afternoon, when the bus dropped Sadie at the foot of the hill, and she walked the remaining distance through the fading light, the familiar black car was waiting. The rear door stood open, and she faltered when she saw her husband seated inside. He wasn't angry. He didn't ask where she had been. He only tilted his head, telling her to get in before she became cold. They rode home in silence, Sadie watching the bare maple trees recede beyond the glass, while instinct told her that he knew, that he had seen, and she waited for judgment, or worse, for pity, the thing she feared most in the world. But only when the mansion appeared beyond the pines and the car slowed on the gravel drive did Connor speak. His eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, and his voice was deep and firm, like a nail being driven into wood. "You don't have to play the kind nurse by yourself anymore. Next Sunday, I'm coming with you." Sadie turned toward him, her lips parting as though she meant to speak, then closing again because her throat had tightened too completely to allow any sound through. She only nodded, a small nod, then turned back toward the window, where evening was falling quickly across the frozen lake, and allowed 2 tears to roll down her face without wiping them away. From the following Sunday onward, as faithfully as the tide, the people at Cedar Point Care Home witnessed a sight no rumor in Boston would ever have believed. The most feared man in the city, the one whose name made the entire underworld lower its voice, sat in his wheelchair beside the wicker chair of a silver-haired woman, patiently listening as she told the same story again and again about some long-ago summer at the harbor, nodding at the proper moments, steadying her cup of orange juice at exactly the right time, week after week without missing a single visit, because perhaps no one in the world understood better than he did what it meant to sit beside someone you loved, close enough to touch their hand, yet forever unable to reach them again. The routine prenatal appointment for her 30th week fell on a crisp, sunlit Tuesday morning, and Sadie had grown accustomed to going alone with Kayla to the small maternity clinic on the edge of the city, the same place where she had registered back when she was still waiting tables, because the prices were reasonable. And the elderly doctor there had warm hands, so she was genuinely startled when she came downstairs and found her husband already seated in the car, wearing a black overcoat, a document case resting on his lap, and an earpiece in one ear as he finished a business call. He merely said that from now on, his wife's appointments would be entered in his schedule, then signaled for the convoy to move. The scene at the clinic that morning would probably be retold among the nurses for the rest of the year. 3 gleaming black cars stood in a neat row outside the single-story pale yellow building, whose glass doors were decorated with pictures of ducklings. 2 broad-shouldered guards stood rigidly on either side of the entrance among pregnant women carrying woven baskets to their appointments, and on the waiting bench against the wall, surrounded by the smell of hand sanitizer and the faint fussing of a child somewhere nearby. The ruler of Boston's entire underworld sat in his wheelchair and finished his call in the same level voice that never rose or fell. "Declan, listen carefully. The shipment at Pier 9 in New Jersey stays exactly where it is until I have the original signature, not a copy. I don't care what the other side threatens. A ship waiting another 2 days costs far less than a forged signature. See that it is done, and 300 miles away, an entire dock, with hundreds of workers and mountains of cargo immediately froze in the most literal sense, because of those few sentences." Then Connor removed the earpiece, slipped it into his breast pocket, and looked up just as a curly-haired pregnant woman carrying a small child hurried after an older one who had broken free from her hand. In her confusion, she thrust an overstuffed bag, printed with pink rabbits, into the lap of the nearest man in a wheelchair and gasped, "Sir, could you watch this for 1 moment? My boy is running for the door again," before disappearing behind the rows of chairs without waiting for an answer. Standing 3 steps away, Sadie watched with her own eyes as the man who had just ordered an entire port to stop held the pink rabbit bag neatly on his lap with an expression of complete solemnity. Both guards outside simultaneously found somewhere else to look, and she had to bite the inside of her lip to keep from laughing aloud. When the curly-haired mother returned to reclaim the bag, thanking him breathlessly and adding, "You look so gentle. Are you about to become a father for the first time?" Connor Kavanagh, who had never been flustered before any counsel, needed a full 2 seconds to find his answer. Yes. The first time, then their names were called. The small ultrasound room barely had space for the examination bed, the monitor, and 2 chairs. The elderly doctor, who knew Sadie well, smiled brightly and said it was wonderful to see everyone present today, while Connor maneuvered his wheelchair close to the edge of the bed and sat with his back straight, as though attending the most important meeting of the year, his eyes fixed on the black screen. Before anything had even appeared, the probe moved across Sadie's stomach. Gray static flickered, then bloomed into the shape of a tiny life curled upon itself, one miniature hand lifting as though in greeting. Then the doctor turned up the sound, and the little room was suddenly filled with something no language could describe to anyone who had never heard it. A rushing, rapid, powerful, persistent rhythm. "There is the heartbeat," the doctor said. 140 beats per minute, steady and very strong. "This little girl is certainly determined." Sadie had heard that sound many times, yet it still stung behind her nose every time, But today she didn't watch the screen. She watched the man beside her, and she saw something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Connor Kavanagh. The man who issued orders of life and death without blinking sat absolutely motionless, both hands gripping the wheelchair armrests, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen as though witnessing a miracle beyond everything he understood about the world. His throat moved once, then twice, and when the doctor asked whether the father had any questions, he remained silent for several seconds before speaking in a voice so soft that Sadie barely recognized her husband. "Doctor, stress. If the mother has been through a great deal of stress, could that hurt the baby?" The elderly doctor looked at him over the rims of her glasses, with the gentle eyes of someone who had delivered 1,000 children, then answered that babies were protected by their mothers far better than most people realized, though from now until the birth, the calmer the mother remained, the healthier the child would be. While she was at it, she taught them both a breathing exercise for pregnancy. Inhale through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 2, then exhale slowly through the mouth for 6 counts, imagining that they were cooling a spoonful of soup. They should practice every evening so that when the day came, the body would remember on its own. Connor, a man built from contracts and procedures, committed the breathing exercise to memory with such seriousness that later that evening he sat in the drawing room, counting the rhythm with her as though reviewing a security operation. Inhale for 4. Hold for 2. Exhale for 6. Again, Sadie finally burst out laughing and told him he had turned a relaxation exercise into a military drill. On the drive home, the car followed the bay beneath scattered sunlight. Sadie rested her head against the window and drifted near sleep when she heard him speak without his usual preamble. "From today forward, her appointments are in my schedule. Even council meetings will be arranged around them. If anyone asks, tell them I am occupied with the most important matter concerning this family." Sadie opened her eyes and turned toward him, ready to tease him, but then she caught what had slipped naturally into the sentence and fell silent. He had said her. Not the child, not your baby, not the heir, just her, as though the word had been waiting on his tongue for a very long time and had only now been given permission to emerge. So instead of teasing him, she merely murmured, "All right," then turned back toward the window and hid her smile against the shoulder of her coat. Sadie heard the rest of the story, about the evenings that followed from Birdie one morning, while the housekeeper folded towels and grumbled in a voice, trying hard to sound annoyed while her eyes smiled. "Do you know, madam, these past few nights, whenever I go around turning off the corridor lights, I keep finding him sitting beside your chair after you have fallen asleep, reading those financial reports dry enough to roof a house. And he reads them aloud, if you can believe it. I asked who he was reading to, and he said he wanted the little girl to become familiar with financial matters, so she wouldn't be bewildered later in life. Have you ever heard such stubborn nonsense? But listen, last night, after you were sound asleep, I saw him continue reading. His voice grew softer and softer, until it sounded exactly like someone singing a lullaby. Happiness had barely begun to take root at Blackwater House when Desmond Kavanagh returned, on a gray afternoon, while Connor was away at a meeting in the harbor office, and this time, he didn't bring the glittering smile from their previous tea. He entered the drawing room with the heavy manner of a man carrying bad news, the silver lighter lying still in his palm instead of turning, and he refused both tea and a chair. He only stood beside the fireplace and looked at Sadie with an expression carefully blended from 3 parts confusion and 7 parts sorrow. "Sadie," he began, his voice lowered as though there had been a death in the house. "I have struggled with myself for 2 weeks. I told myself silence would be kinder, but I can't do it. You are carrying a child. You are about to bind your entire life to this family. And I believe a woman like you would rather suffer from the truth than rest peacefully inside a lie. So I apologize in advance for what is in here." He placed a dark blue folder on the low table between them, straightened the edge of the papers with an almost reverent gesture, then stepped back. Sadie looked at the folder with the instinct of an animal that had scented a trap, but still had to approach because the bait was called truth. She opened the cover, and with every page, her world began to tilt by another degree. The first page contained corporate records for a construction company named Harborline Construction, with a tangled ownership chart full of arrows that all ended at a parent corporation, bearing the Kavanagh name, circled in red ink. The second page was a contract for the construction of an apartment complex in Dorchester. The third was a safety report from that very site, with quarterly inspection signatures regularly confirming that the scaffolding met standards. The fourth was an incident report from a morning in October of the previous year, the day the fifth-floor scaffolding at the Dorchester site collapsed and dragged down with it a 29-year-old worker named Daniel Reeves. Sadie sat very straight and very still. Only the paper in her hand trembled, because she knew that name better than anyone in the world. She had spoken it over the telephone during every lunch break for 6 years. She had embroidered it into the corner of a handkerchief meant to become a wedding gift. She had carved it into the smallest gravestone she could afford at the cemetery. Her Danny, and the final page of the folder drove in the last nail. It was an internal audit memorandum stating that Harborline's safety reports had been cosmetically improved on paper for 2 straight years, that scaffolding maintenance had been cut to reduce costs, and that the inspection signatures had never been accompanied by any real inspection at all. I only found it by chance while reviewing the accounts of the subsidiaries. Desmond's voice reached her from somewhere very far away, breaking in exactly the right place. I hoped I had misunderstood it. Believe me, no one in the family wanted this. Perhaps Connor himself didn't know. Large corporations are like that. A signature from the highest floor is sometimes nothing more than procedure. But even so, you have the right to know whose name you are carrying. He bowed his head and took his leave with exactly the right measure of delicacy, leaving Sadie alone with the folder and the sound of wood cracking in the fireplace. She sat there without knowing how long, one hand unconsciously rising to the chain beneath her collar, where beside an old silver bracelet hung a plain gold ring that had remained there for 7 months. Danny had paid for that ring in installments for 18 months, one small payment each month, hidden from her so he could surprise her. The jewelry store had called her 1 week after the funeral to collect it, along with the final receipt dated the day of the accident itself. That meant that on that morning, before climbing onto the 5th-floor scaffolding, Danny had stopped at the bank and made the last payment. He had held in his hand the receipt proving the wedding ring finally belonged to him completely, and he had died that same afternoon before ever seeing it inside its velvet box. The ring had never once been placed on anyone's finger. It had only been threaded onto a chain and rested for 7 months against the chest of the woman. It had never been given the chance to ask to marry him. When Connor returned home at dusk, he found his wife standing in the middle of the library, the blue folder lying on the desk between them like a body waiting to be identified. He had barely spoken her name when everything inside Sadie broke open, for the first time since entering Blackwater House, and perhaps for the first time in the life of the man before her. Someone dared to shout at Connor Kavanagh. "Read it." She shoved the folder across the desk toward him. Her voice was no longer the voice of the composed wife who sat across from him each morning. It was torn ragged at the edges. "Harborline, Dorchester, 5th-floor scaffolding. Read it, and then tell me. The man buried beneath that steel was my fiancé. He was the father of the baby kicking inside me right now. He died under your family's scaffolding, at your family's construction site, because of false reports carrying your family's seal. And I am here, wearing the sweater your family bought, eating the food your household cooks, giving the Kavanagh name to the child of the man who died. Say something, Connor. Say one thing." She stood there breathing hard, one arm wrapped around her stomach, tears falling without any attempt to wipe them away. Connor Kavanagh sat motionless and received every word, as a man standing still beneath gunfire. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't defend himself. He didn't point out that the corporation owned hundreds of subsidiaries. He didn't ask where the folder had come from, though his eyes had already darkened when he glanced through it. He simply remained silent for a long time after her shouting ended, long enough for the wood in the fireplace to collapse inward once. Then he lifted his gaze and looked directly into the reddened eyes of his wife, and spoke in the heartbreaking calm of a man who had just been handed a sentence he had no right to appeal immediately. "Sadie," he said, "I can swear to you right now that I had never heard the name Harborline before tonight, but my oath is worth nothing to you at this moment, and it shouldn't be. So I am asking you for exactly one thing. Give me 3 days. 3 days to turn over every page connected to that company. If the truth is what this folder says it is, I will place it before you with my own hands, complete, uncut, without excuse, even if it condemns me. And if you believe 3 days is too long, the doors of this house are open, the car is always waiting, and every term promised to you remains intact. Whether you leave or stay, those 3 days begin tonight." Sadie looked at him through her tears, searching his face for the smallest fracture of deception, the way she had learned to search people through 7 years behind a counter, and she found nothing except pain being held down by every ounce of discipline he had built over a lifetime of command. She didn't say she was leaving. She didn't say she was staying. She only cradled her stomach, turned away, and walked out of the library. Behind her, in the room filled with books and darkness, Connor Kavanagh pulled the blue folder closer, opened the first page. In the 3 longest days Blackwater House had ever known began counting their first hours. For those 3 days, the library at Blackwater House remained lit until dawn. Cars arrived carrying box after box of records from the harbor office. The family's private auditors came and went through the side entrance, and Connor Kavanagh, clearer-headed than he had been at any point in the previous 20 months, now that his medication had been adjusted, turned over every document connected to harbor line construction, as though lifting stones in search of venomous snakes. He traced the overlapping ownership lines, maintenance invoices paid to contractors that existed only on paper, and the excess funds that moved through 3 intermediary companies before disappearing into an anonymous trust. By dawn on the 3rd day, when the elderly auditor placed the final reconciliation before him, every arrow on the tangled chart converged at a single point. The authorization signature approving Harborline's maintenance budget, the signature that allowed safety measures to be cut so the surplus could flow into shell contractors, belonged to the family's second in command, the man who shared Connor's blood, Desmond Kavanagh. Connor sat motionless before that discovery for a very long time, then made a decision that startled even the elderly auditor. The name would remain secret. Every piece of evidence against Desmond would be sealed inside Connor's private safe, because a snake should only be struck after the whole of its nest had been exposed. But where the truth belonging to the dead was concerned, there would not be another second of delay. That very afternoon, the Kavanagh Corporation issued a public statement admitting the workplace safety violations at the Dorchester construction site. It didn't blame subcontractors. It didn't hide behind a lawyer's carefully chosen language. It accepted full responsibility as the parent company, announced a compensation fund for all 8 families of Harborline victims from the previous 3 years, and, in the detail that consumed the most newspaper ink across the city, declared that the chairman himself, the wheelchair-bound man who had not appeared before a camera since the explosion, would visit each family personally to apologize. Sadie learned all of it through the news and through Bertie's choked retelling. She still hadn't spoken a word to her husband since the night in the library, but on the afternoon of the 3rd day, when he knocked on her door, placed the evidence concerning Harborline on the table in front of her, arranged exactly as he had promised, complete, uncut, without excuse, then told her there was one more place he needed to go before the 3 days ended, and that although he didn't dare ask, he hoped she would accompany him. Sadie looked into the eyes hollowed by 3 sleepless nights and silently went to fetch her coat. St. Michael's Cemetery lay beneath a thin layer of snow that afternoon, rows of gray headstones standing quietly under the low sky, and Sadie led the way through paths whose every turn she knew by heart, toward the modest section on the far side of the hill, where the smallest marker in the row bore the words Daniel Reeves. 29 years old, devoted worker, faithful love. She stepped back once they arrived, 'cause she understood that this journey wasn't hers. Connor moved his wheelchair forward until he faced the stone. Across his lap rested a simple bouquet of white daisies, the kind bought at an ordinary market, not flowers grown in the greenhouses of the wealthy. He placed them at the foot of the grave with both hands, then sat upright in his chair beneath the softly falling snow, level with the headstone, as though 2 men were seated across from one another. He spoke in a deep, clear voice that didn't tremble, as though reading a pledge meant to remain binding forever. "Mr. Reeves, I am Connor Kavanagh. The scaffolding that took your life stood on land belonging to my family. The false documents that protected it carried my family's seal. I haven't come to ask your forgiveness because there are debts forgiveness can't repay, and I won't insult you by asking for it. I came to promise, before you and before the woman to whom both you and I oh, more than we can ever return. That your daughter will grow up lacking nothing in this world except you, and because that absence can never be replaced, I owe you the rest of my life, one day at a time, until my final day." Snow fell slowly among the headstones, and Sadie stood behind the wheelchair with both hands cradling her stomach, tears falling without sound, because in that moment she understood what had been happening quietly inside her heart. She hadn't fallen in love with this man because he was innocent. Innocence was a matter of chance that anyone might possess. She had fallen in love because, before a grave no one had required him to visit, he had willingly knelt, in the only way his legs still allowed, and taken upon his shoulders the full weight of a crime that wasn't his, simply because it carried his name. That night and in the nights that followed, another war began, without banners or trumpets, in places far beyond the lights of Blackwater House. The director of the shell contractor, who had signed the false maintenance reports, opened his office one Monday morning and found 2 tax inspectors waiting, with an order to examine 5 years of records. The financial broker, who had created the 3 intermediary companies for the stolen money, received a notice from the bank calling in every loan before its term because of a revised risk assessment. A small law office that specialized in legitimizing documents for anonymous trusts suddenly lost every client within a month and quietly surrendered its lease. Each incident came several days or weeks after the last. Each wore a different face of misfortune. They were scattered enough that no local newspaper bothered to connect them, and natural enough that the man behind all those names could do nothing but sit in his apartment, turning his silver lighter faster and faster, suspicious, searching the air, yet unable to find a single piece of evidence proving that this was the work of a human hand rather than fate. Meanwhile, in the library at Blackwater House, every night after the household had gone to sleep, Connor opened a drawer and removed a handwritten list. Mackie, the only man who knew half the truth, once watched his employer draw out a fountain pen and strike a perfectly straight line through the name of someone who had fallen that week, as calmly as a man crossing off a paid bill. When Mackie finally asked why he hadn't chosen the faster method, the method Connor's father surely would have used, Connor replaced the cap on the pen, looked at the 3 names still uncrossed, and answered in the voice of a man who had considered that question longer than a lifetime. "A man who kills through paperwork should die through paperwork, Mackie. My brother dreamed of a clean family, and I intend to repay that debt in full, so even my revenge from now on must be clean." The leaf Sadie had once set upon the current finally drifted back to her on an evening early in the week, while Kayla Bennett was helping her prepare for bed. The young nurse, usually as quiet as a shadow, suddenly froze in the middle of the room, twisting both hands together before the words burst from her in the trembling voice of someone who had held something inside for far too long. "Madam, there is something I have to tell you. I know I shouldn't, but I have been thinking about you for the past several nights, and I can't sleep." Tears gathered in the girl's eyes as she explained that lately, on nights when she couldn't sleep and looked out from her bedroom window, she had seen a light burning inside the old boathouse beside the lake, the boathouse that had been abandoned before she ever arrived. The light stayed on very late, sometimes until nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. She was frightened, but she hadn't dared tell anyone because she no longer knew whom she could trust inside that house. Sadie listened, and in her mind the scattered pieces immediately arranged themselves into a terrifying shape. The scratches around the 3rd-floor lock, the cleanly severed brake cable, and now a midnight light inside an abandoned building hidden beyond the garden. If Desmond or one of his men needed a way in and out of Blackwater without passing through the main gates, what place could have been more perfect? So that night, after the entire mansion had fallen asleep, she put on her thickest cloak, slipped her telephone into her pocket with her thumb already resting over Mackie's number, and followed the snow-covered gravel path toward the frozen lake. Sure enough, through the gaps between the old boards, a narrow ribbon of warm yellow light trembled in the darkness. She pressed herself against the wooden wall and held her breath, preparing herself to see Desmond's beautiful, treacherous face, or perhaps some stranger searching through the place. Then she gently pushed open the door that had been left ajar, and every scenario she had built inside her mind collapsed without leaving a single brick standing. In the middle of the dusty wooden floor, beneath the light of a storm lantern resting on a crate, Connor Kavanagh lay on his side, His wheelchair had overturned an arm's length away. An ebony walking cane had fallen even farther, and his soaked shirt clung to a back trembling with exhaustion. Beneath the partially rolled trouser leg on his left side, a titanium leg brace gleamed coldly, still strapped tightly around his calf. In a single second, everything became clear with merciless precision. The blood beneath his cuff on her first day, the roll of gauze in the wastebasket, the fall she had heard through the wall that night, the sound of wheels returning late, none of it had been evidence of an enemy. It had been the evidence of a solitary war that this man had chosen to fight in darkness for months alone, night after night. Sadie stood rooted to the threshold, her heart aching with a fierce tenderness powerful enough to frighten her. She had learned from the night behind the closed door that she mustn't rush toward him, so she lowered her voice until it was calm and gentle, then asked from the doorway, "Will you allow me to help, or should I close the door and forget what I have just seen?" Connor's entire body stiffened. He turned his face away into the darkness, and she watched his pride struggle in silence for a stretch of time that felt as long as winter itself before the answer finally broke from him, hoarse and split in two. "Help me." She crossed the wooden floor and knelt beside him, despite the weight of her pregnancy, righted the wheelchair, and braced it with the full weight of her body. Little by little, through the strength of his arms and the patience of hers, the man returned to his seat, his chest rising and falling, his hair soaked with sweat even though their breath still formed clouds in the cold. When his breathing had finally eased, Sadie asked the only question that remained. "Why, Connor?" "Every night, alone out here. What are you trying to do?" He stared for a long time at the cane, lying abandoned on the floor, then answered without looking at her, in the voice of a man who would rather throw himself into the frozen lake than confess what came next. "Last week, I passed the drawing room and heard you speaking with Bertie. You didn't know I was there. You said you didn't resent being poor, and you didn't resent being widowed. You said there was only one thing that hurt you, that your daughter would be born without a father's arms waiting for her on the other side of her first cry." He paused, his fingers tightening around the wheel rim. "The independent doctor said the damage wasn't complete. He said that with the right medicine and enough training, perhaps. But I don't need perhaps, I need certainty. So I want to stand Sadie, even if it is only for 1 minute. On the day she is born, she deserves to be welcomed into this world by a father standing on his own 2 feet. No matter how many nights like this it costs me, I will pay them." Something broke open inside Sadie's chest. It wasn't merely tears, though tears came too. It was the final wall, the boundary she had raised on the day she signed the contract, and had reminded herself every day not to cross. It collapsed without a sound before the sight of the most powerful man in Boston, lying on the dusty floor of an old boathouse, trying to stand for 1 minute for a child who carried none of his blood. Then he lifted his eyes to her, and saw every shattered thing written plainly across her face, and the distance between them disappeared. He pulled her into their first kiss, the kiss she would remember for the rest of her life, along with the lantern light, the cane lying on the floor, and the hoarse question he whispered against her lips about what was still broken inside him and what was not. And this was her answer, the part that only the 2 of them and the storm lantern heard that night. Sadie drew back just far enough to look directly into the gray eyes braced for a fall, placed both hands around his face, and spoke each word slowly and clearly so that not one syllable could be misunderstood. "Listen to me, Connor Kavanagh. I have never been afraid of your wheelchair. Not for a single second in all these months. What frightened me enough to pull away just now was something entirely different. It was knowing that once I truly loved you with the truest part of myself, I would never again be able to pretend this was only a contract. I would lose the last safe refuge I had left. That is what frightened me. But you have never been something I feared." The storm lantern burned lower on the wooden crate. Snow began falling again beyond the boathouse windows, thickening over the frozen lake, and slowly erasing the 2 trails of footprints leading from the mansion to the water's edge. And that night, for the first time in 20 months, the light inside the old boathouse went out earlier than usual. The next morning, Bertie entered the dining room carrying the tea tray and nearly dropped it for the 2nd time in her life, because beneath the edge of the breakfast table, the master's hand and the mistress's hand were intertwined with the natural ease of 2 people who had been doing it for 10 years. But happiness at Blackwater House had always been a guest that never stayed longer than a single night, and this time it departed just before noon, when a preliminary meeting of the elders was convened at the mansion to review the agenda for the spring council session, now only a few weeks away. The 8 senior members sat around the long table, with papers spread before them, and among the stacks of documents the secretary had prepared for each place, no one knew when or how, a pale yellow envelope with no sender's name had appeared, positioned neatly in the center, where everyone entering the room would see it. The elder seated nearest opened it by instinct, and the color drained from his face so quickly that the entire room fell silent with him. Inside was a paternity test, bearing the seal of a private laboratory, concluding in cold clinical language that the unborn child carried by Mrs. Kavanagh had no genetic connection whatsoever to the Kavanagh bloodline. Accompanying it were several printed pages of messages, allegedly taken from Sadie's telephone, exchanges with an unfamiliar number about maintaining the disguise, about the inherited fortune, about how once the council session was over, everything would belong to us. Every word had been fabricated with such skill that even the brief rhythm of Sadie's usual messages had been imitated. Whispers spread around the table like fire through dry straw. Every gaze turned towards Sadie, who sat frozen at the far end, the blood leaving her face in waves. In the middle of it all, Connor Kavanagh extended one hand. Someone placed the envelope in it. He read through everything in exactly 10 seconds, not a ripple crossing his face. Then, before the eyes of all 8 elders, he tore the papers in half, stacked the pieces together, tore them in half again, and dropped the 4 fragments onto the table, as though discarding a handful of refuse. "My daughter's parentage," he said, his voice never rising, yet reaching every corner of the room, was established by a contract bearing my signature and recognized by law. She is the heir to this family because I have declared her so, and my declaration requires no laboratory's approval. As for this anonymous rubbish, anyone in this room, or outside it, who repeats its contents even once, even half a sentence, will no longer have a seat in any room where I am sitting. The meeting will continue, and the meeting did continue, with an almost unnatural smoothness. No one dared look toward the far end of the table again, but Sadie sat through the remainder of it with both hands cold in her lap, because she had seen something the 8 elders had not. In the instant before Connor tore the pages apart, for no more than 1/100th of a second, her husband's eyes had paused on the forged messages, and in those eyes was something that wasn't contempt for a filthy trick. It was a question. That question knocked on the library door. Later that night, after the house had gone to sleep, when Sadie went to find him so they could discuss tracing the envelope. She had barely closed the heavy wooden door behind her when Connor, seated with his back toward her and his face turned to the fire, spoke without looking around. His voice was so quiet it nearly dissolved into the crackling flames. "Sadie, tell me there was nothing true in any of it." For 1 second, the room seemed to lose all its air. She stood motionless beside the door and felt the words travel through her chest like a blade drawing slowly across flesh, because they hurt more than any shouted accusation could have, an accusation she could have fought. This was a plea, which meant that somewhere beneath the steel of the man who had torn those papers apart before the entire council, the worm of doubt had already burrowed inside and carved a path. When she answered, her voice didn't break. It merely grew colder by degrees, like water after the fire beneath it had been removed. "Do you know what hurts most about the question you just asked, Connor? It isn't that you doubted me. Everyone has the right to doubt. It is that 12 hours ago, you stood before 8 of the most powerful old men in your world and tore that slander apart without blinking. You defended your wife magnificently in front of everyone. Then night came, the door closed, and when only the 2 of us in this fire remained, you turned away and asked me to deny it. So the defense this afternoon was a performance for the council, while the doubt was what you kept for yourself. After the boathouse, I believed I was the person you trusted in the place where no one else could see. I put my faith in the wrong place. She didn't wait for him to answer. She didn't give him the chance to repair the words. She turned and walked out of the library, hearing behind her the wheelchair move forward half a turn before stopping, hearing her name break from his mouth and die halfway through. But she didn't stop, not because she had ceased loving him, but because pain needed work to do, or it would swallow her whole, and that work had been waiting in her mind since noon. Whoever had been close enough to place the envelope at the center of a private meeting, whoever knew the rhythm of her messages well enough to imitate her voice in writing, was also the person who had left the scratches around the third-floor lock. And if someone had searched the dead man's room for so long without finding what they wanted, then whatever they sought must still be there. That night, carrying the master key ring borrowed from Bertie's room and a small flashlight, Sadie climbed the stairs one step at a time to the east wing of the third floor. She inserted the key into the brass lock marked by the familiar scratches, and the door opened onto a world abandoned by time. Brendan Kavanagh's office remained exactly as it had been on its owner's final morning. A coffee cup, empty and hardened with age, sat on the desk. A sweater hung carelessly over the back of a chair. A board covered in notes outlined unfinished plans for turning the family's businesses legitimate. Everything lay beneath a thin film of dust, and across that dust were unmistakable traces of earlier searches, filing cabinet drawers left slightly open, books removed and returned unevenly to their shelves, the wall safe behind a painting standing wide open and empty. Someone had torn through this room many times, carefully, desperately, and had always left empty-handed. Sadie stood in the center of the office and slowly turned in a circle. She didn't search where that person had searched, because she had grown up in a world entirely different from theirs, a world where people hid a week's worth of tips beneath the false bottom of a sugar box in a diner kitchen, so they wouldn't spend them by mistake. She murmured the words her father had once spoken while teaching her how to fit such a removable wooden base into place. The safest hiding place in the world isn't the one that is hardest to open, sweetheart. It is the one people become too bored to examine. She went straight to the desk, pulled out the center drawer, emptied it of pens, rulers, and other small objects, then tapped lightly against the wooden bottom. A hollow knock echoed through the silent room. She worked a fingernail into the narrow seam, and the false base lifted as lightly as a breath. Beneath it lay a thick leather-bound ledger filled with columns of handwritten figures, tracking money through companies whose names she now recognized from the Harbor Line evidence. Resting on top of the ledger was an old mobile phone, powered off, with its charging cable neatly coiled beside it. Her hands trembling, she plugged the charger into the socket behind the desk. After several minutes, the screen came to life, and there in the center, inside an unfinished voice message that had never been sent, appeared a single audio file. She pressed it, and within the dust-covered room of the dead, the voice of a young man sounded, warm, urgent, so alive that her heart tightened. "Connor, it's me. I found it. The money moving through Harbor Line and those other 3 companies. I followed it all the way to the end. It is Desmond. Do you hear me? It is Desmond himself. I am confronting him tonight. As soon as it is done, I will call you." Beneath the recording, the date appeared clearly in the flashlight's glow. The very day Brendan Kavanagh had taken his brother's place behind the wheel and never returned. Sadie carried the ledger and the old telephone down from the 3rd floor that night and hid them in the only kind of place she trusted. According to the habits of a lifetime, an old tin cookie box tucked among the knitting supplies in her room. Something so ordinary that no one searching the house would bother looking at it twice. She intended to place everything before Connor the following morning and let Brendan's voice finish the work that every explanation between them was now powerless to do. But morning arrived with an unexpected car carrying 2 elders who had come to discuss family business, and the afternoon swept Connor away into meetings preparing for the council session. Between 2 people still divided by a fracture that hadn't yet healed, every opportunity to sit down together slipped away for another day, then another. And during those lost days, in the east wing of the 3rd floor, a gloved hand once again inserted a key into the brass lock. Desmond Kavanagh had returned to the dead man's room for another desperate search, one of so many that even he had lost count. This time, when he pulled open the center drawer of the desk, as part of his habitual inspection of the places he had already searched, he suddenly stopped. The bottom panel sat no more than a hair's breadth out of alignment with the wooden frame. He slipped his fingers beneath it and pried it loose, and the empty space below stared back at him like a wide-open eye. Someone had arrived before him. Someone had found what he had hunted for 20 months, and in the entire mansion, only one person possessed the kind of mind that would think of false bottoms. The silver lighter in his hand turned once, then twice, then faster and faster, like the second hand of a bomb counting down. He no longer had the luxury of waiting. The council session was only 10 days away. The evidence was in someone else's hands, and when a gambler smelled the ruin of his final stake, he did the only thing left to him. He placed everything on one last wager. That wager began on Friday afternoon, arranged with the precision of a composition written in 3 parts. The first part sounded at 3:45, when the mansion's emergency telephone began ringing insistently. The caller identified himself as a representative of Pierce's law office and supplied every internal contact code correctly, down to the final character. Tobias Lawson, he reported, had just been taken into emergency custody at the Central Police Station after the matter involving his old account had unexpectedly been reopened. His legal guardian had to appear before 7 o'clock that evening to sign the necessary intervention papers. Sadie received the news with her hands and feet turning cold. Every rational thought inside her heard only 2 words: Toby in custody. The second part had begun an hour earlier without anyone realizing it, when Connor suddenly felt strangely dizzy after his afternoon tea. The words on the documents before him blurred into 2 overlapping layers. The heaviness he had forgotten since changing his medication returned like a murky tide. The third part completed the composition at 4:15, when an emergency report arrived from the harbor concerning a small fire in Warehouse 3 and evidence of a break-in, forcing Mackey to personally lead half the security team toward the city, in accordance with the very procedure he had written himself. In the grand entrance hall, Sadie hurriedly put on her cloak, while Connor, though his mind was already struggling against a chemical fog, tightened every security measure with what remained of his awareness. She would take the mansion's armored car, not an ordinary vehicle. The driver would be the man who had served the family for 20 years, and Hugh, the silent young guard Mackey trusted above all others, would sit in the front passenger seat. Connor followed her in his wheelchair all the way to the entrance, caught her gently by the wrist, and drew her down toward him. He placed a kiss against her forehead, his first tender gesture since the night in the library, like an apology that hadn't yet found words. "Call me the moment you arrive," he instructed, his speech already beginning to blur slightly, even as his eyes fought to remain sharp. "Don't leave the car until Hugh tells you it is safe." Sadie nodded, her hand lingering in his for half a second before she climbed into the vehicle, and the iron gates of Blackwater House closed behind the car as evening descended with unnatural speed. The black car had traveled for less than 10 minutes and had just crossed the second stone bridge, where the road along the bay narrowed between 2 stretches of pine forest, when the driver slammed on the brakes. A truck lay across the road like some enormous animal that had collapsed from illness, and before anyone could shift into reverse, 3 figures emerged from the trees on either side, moving around the vehicle with the smooth coordination of professionals. They weren't highway robbers. Sadie understood that immediately through the icy instinct running down her spine. Highway robbers didn't choose the exact stretch of road without cameras. They didn't block the front and seal the rear with such practiced precision. Hugh understood too. He shouted for the driver to lock the doors and call for help, then threw himself out of the front seat and stood alone between the 3 men and the rear door where the mistress of the house was sitting. The fight that followed was brief, unfolding across the snow in the final light of day. Hugh fought with everything Mackey had taught him, decisively and stubbornly, bringing down one man before the other 2 could close in. But 2 against 1 on an icy road was a problem with no graceful solution. He fell beside the wheel after a brutal strike, and what shattered Sadie's heart was that even as he lay in the snow, unable to rise, the young guard still clung to one attacker's leg and still called out to her, "Run, madam." "Run toward the streetlights." Sadie obeyed. She threw open the door on the opposite side, burst from the car, and ran toward the slope descending into the pine forest. She ran with all the strength a woman, nearly 8 months pregnant, could summon, each breath tearing through her chest, while the deep snow swallowed every step as though trying to hold her in place for the men pursuing her. The black pines streaked past the edges of her vision, and for 10 frantic seconds she truly believed she might escape. Then 2 powerful hands closed around her arms from behind and brought her to an abrupt stop halfway down the slope. The grip was as firm as iron clamps, yet strangely careful. They didn't shove her or drag her to the ground. They held her as though she were merchandise they had been repeatedly warned not to damage. "Be careful with her," a rough voice said behind her. "The order is that not a single hair on her head is to be touched." Instead of reassuring her, those words poured into Sadie a fear deeper than any beating could have inspired. Because if someone needed her preserved so carefully, then they needed something from her, worth even more than her life. As she twisted instinctively against their grip, the chain beneath her collar caught in the folds of her scarf and snapped. Two small objects, one silver and one gold, fell into the snow and rolled away. The old silver bracelet and the ring that had never been worn remained behind in the dirty snow beside the road, and not one of the men bothered to bend down and retrieve them. When a thick cloth was pulled over her eyes, and she was placed in the back seat of another car, whose smooth comfort felt more terrifying than violence, Sadie Lawson closed her eyes beneath the darkness and began doing something she had learned from her husband without ever realizing it. A person stripped of every power over their circumstances still possessed one final right that no one could take away: the right to pay attention. She memorized the long scar running across the back of the hand that closed the car door. She memorized the distinctive squeal of an unoiled van door hinge sounding twice. She counted 3 left turns, and one right before they reached the main road. After approximately 40 minutes, she heard the tires change from pavement to gravel, and the scent of the air entering through the window gradually shifted from pine forest to something she recognized with the whole of her childhood: the smell of still water from a broad lake in the process of freezing. The news reached Blackwater House in 3 successive waves. The driver reported that the convoy had been stopped at the stone bridge. Mackie raced back from the city with Warehouse 3 behind him, untouched, and without so much as a trace of fire. Then Pierce's law office, when contacted for verification, confirmed that they had issued no notice of any kind concerning Tobias Lawson that afternoon. The student was still sitting in his school studio, working on a drawing. Those 3 pieces came together into a single truth. The entire afternoon had been staged, and the mistress of Blackwater had been taken in the middle of it. Connor Kavanagh listened in silence. The chemical fog inside his head burned away in patches beneath the force of rage and fear, and the instinct of the past 20 months rose like a reflex from the spine. He ordered the garage opened and a car brought around. He would go himself, alone, just as he had endured everything alone since the night his brother's car exploded. But this time, in the center of the grand hall, a large figure stepped directly into the path of his wheelchair and planted himself there. Mackie stood with both hands at his sides, the eyes of an old soldier fixed on his commander. "Sir," he said, each word slow and clear. "Trusting us isn't the same as surrendering command. The entire team stands behind you, but you have to be the mind. Don't demand to be the fist." Connor remained motionless for 3 full seconds, his knuckles white against the wheel rims, and then something inside him, something that had been frozen for 20 months, cracked and began to thaw. "All right," he said, his voice suddenly sharpening like a newly honed blade. "Then listen carefully. Bertie, go to the mistress's room. Search through her belongings. She is smarter than all of us put together. If she found anything on the 3rd floor, she would have hidden it somewhere no one would bother examining." 3 minutes later, the housekeeper came running downstairs carrying the tin cookie box. Brendan's ledger and old telephone lay inside. Connor played the recording, and the voice of his dead brother filled the stone hall, leaving the entire security team frozen. "It is Desmond. Do you hear me? It is Desmond himself. I hear you," Connor whispered into the empty air. 20 months later, I hear you clearly. Little brother." Meanwhile, an hour's drive to the northwest, Sadie's blindfold was removed in a drawing room thick with the warmth of a fire. The floors were new wood, the corridors wide, and there wasn't a single step anywhere. Seated across from her at a low table, as relaxed as a host receiving an honored guest, was Desmond Kavanagh. "Miss Sadie," he said, pushing a prepared set of documents and a silver-inlaid fountain pen toward her. "I apologize for the method, but time no longer allows for courtesy. This is a declaration, with a notary waiting nearby, stating that you, as Connor Kavanagh's wife and the person closest to him, confirm that his ability to lead has deteriorated because of his injuries and medication. Attached is a trust agreement. The child will remain the heir. She will remain with you. No one will touch either of you. The only difference is that I will manage the inheritance as trustee until the girl reaches adulthood. Sign it, and you and your daughter may live in comfort on any coast you choose. Refuse, and Dr. Hale has medicines capable of making the testimony of an exhausted pregnant woman sound no different from delirium. Either way, this document will bear your name before the council session. At Blackwater House, Kayla Bennett was questioned without a single threat. Connor merely placed on the table the promissory note belonging to her younger brother, which his men had uncovered within 10 minutes, and said, "I know Desmond is holding this over you. I promise in Bertie's presence that if you tell the truth, no one will punish you." The young nurse broke down and confessed everything. She revealed every question Desmond had ordered her to answer, the mistress's daily schedule, her Sunday bus trips, and one question he had repeated throughout the final month, whether the mistress often went up to the 3rd floor. Connor assembled the pieces, the ledger, the recording, the testimony, and the map of family properties spread across the table. He needed a secluded place with a notary already available, and, ironically, one designed to accommodate a wheelchair-bound man as an honored hostage if necessary. Connor's finger stopped on a name along the northwestern shore of the Great Lake, Fairhaven, the retreat whose entire ground floor was renovated for me during the first year after the explosion. Desmond knows it like the back of his hand, but there is one thing he doesn't know. The internal telephone line I had installed while I was recovering is still active. I never ordered it disconnected, because that house was the last place where Brendan spent an entire winter sitting beside me. At Fairhaven, Sadie pushed the documents away. Desmond released the sigh of a man forced to spend his final coin. "Do you still believe you are merely a victim swept into Kavanagh family affairs?" he asked, his voice suddenly stripped of every layer of velvet. "Did you never wonder why every document from your life arrived so neatly on Pierce's desk? Let me tell you, I didn't choose you because you were pitiful. I bought Danny's debts from 6 different creditors. I lured your brother into that account. I placed your file, complete down to every page of your mother's medical records, on my cousin's lawyer's desk. You were a bomb with the fuse already attached. Do you understand? The widow of a man killed at a Kavanagh construction site. All I had to do was place you in Connor's marriage bed and wait for the day I chose to strike the match. Your marriage, from the first signature you placed in that office, was a script written by me. The room fell silent except for the quiet crackle of firewood in the hearth. Sadie looked at the man before her, while the silver lighter between his fingers turned more slowly, then slower still, before stopping completely, as though even he were holding his breath and waiting for her to collapse. But at the very moment when her entire world should have shattered, a contraction brought on by stress tightened around her abdomen, and instead of panicking, Sadie's body remembered what it had practiced during those evenings in the Blackwater drawing room. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 6, cool a spoonful of soup. She breathed slowly and evenly, then used her exhaustion as cover. "Let me sit in a softer chair," she said weakly, "and let me read the trust terms again. If I sign, I need written protection for my mother's care." Smelling victory, Desmond left the table to summon the notary and Hale from the adjoining room. During those 2 minutes, Sadie leaned against the furniture and dragged herself toward the corner she had been watching since the moment she entered, where an old internal telephone hung on the wall, dusty but still connected. She lifted the receiver, her heart pounding when a long dial tone sounded. She pressed the button for the mansion switchboard, and when she heard a click on the other end, she had time to whisper only 2 words. "Fairhaven." Quickly, then she replaced the receiver and returned to her chair before the approaching footsteps reached the room. When Desmond entered with the notary behind him, he found the pregnant woman sitting upright, unnaturally calm. She looked directly into his eyes and spoke in a voice that no longer carried the slightest trace of weakness. "You know, Desmond, I admit it. You managed to write an entire marriage contract. You even directed an entire life. But there is exactly one thing you will never be able to write, and that is what happens after the signature." The 2 words Fairhaven traveled back to Blackwater House, through the old internal telephone line, like a spark racing along a slow-burning fuse. And 40 minutes later, beneath the darkness of early night, the Kavanagh family convoy turned off its lights and slipped onto the gravel road bordering the Great Lake. Connor didn't order a direct assault through the main gate. He knew this house better than the man occupying it, and he led Mackey's team around to the rear grounds, where a smooth stone ramp ran from the parking area to the veranda. the ramp that had been built 20 months earlier for a man who was just learning how to live on 4 wheels. Tonight, that same man crossed it swiftly and silently, like an insult delivered back to fate. The carbon fiber wheelchair swept across the veranda. The glass door was unlocked soundlessly by the security team, and Connor Kavanagh entered the Fairhaven drawing room at the exact moment Desmond was placing the fountain pen before Sadie for the second time. Everything froze for 1 second. Then Desmond sprang to his feet and shouted for his men, and from 2 corridors, 6 of them rushed into the room, forming a line between the wheelchair and the low table. 6 large men stood before 1 seated man, and Connor didn't retreat by so much as half a turn of the wheels. He merely sat straighter, moved his gaze slowly across every face, then began calling their names. He didn't shout, he simply called them, like taking attendance, Colm Brady. Your wife's name is Maura. Your daughter is in her 2nd year of medical school on a scholarship from the Family Foundation. Pat Nolan. Your father worked at Pier 2 for 30 years. When he needed heart surgery, my father was the man who authorized an advance of 1 year's wages. Seamus, Rory, Jack, Liam, each name fell with the name of a wife, a child, or an old debt of gratitude, and the color slowly drained from 6 hardened faces as each man heard himself called. I know how much Desmond is paying you for tonight, Connor continued, his voice still no louder than the firewood burning in the hearth, and I don't blame hired men for accepting wages, so I am giving you 10 seconds and 1 door. Anyone who walks through that door now will be treated by this family as though we never saw him here. Anyone who remains should plant his feet carefully, because after 10 seconds, I will remember for a very long time. 1 second passed, then 2. Colm Brady was the first to lower his head, place his iron bar on the wooden floor, and walk toward the door. Pat Nolan followed. Then the others went one by one. 6 sounds of metal striking wood rang through the room like 6 hammer blows sealing the coffin of Desmond's final wager. He shouted after them, "You faithless bastards. I pay your wages. I pay 3 times what he pays." Connor looked at him across the now empty room and answered with a sentence as soft as falling snow and as heavy as stone. "You pay their wages, Desmond. But I am the man they tell their children about. That is the one thing you will never have enough money to buy." At that exact moment Sadie acted. Dr. Hale, who had been hiding beside the fireplace, panicked and pulled a vial from inside his coat, lunging toward her as though grasping for the final lifeline of the entire plan. But the woman who had spent 7 years behind a counter, carrying trays filled with glasses, possessed quicker reflexes than a dishonest old doctor. She struck his wrist aside. The vial flew halfway across the room and shattered against the hearth tiles. Then she turned and tore open the heavy curtains covering the large window. Headlights from the rear courtyard flooded the room, along with the shadows of the security team closing in, allowing every pair of eyes outside to see every inch of what was happening within. With one final movement, she seized the trust documents from the table and threw them into the fire. The carefully drafted pages curled in the flames, blackened, then flared brightly. "There is your plan, Desmond," she said. It burned for exactly 3 seconds. Mackie burst into the room and locked Hale's arms behind him with the clean twisting motion of a Marine. Desmond, seeing the room closing around him from every direction, did the only thing left in the instincts of a ruined gambler. He snatched the bulging leather case from beneath the table. The case he had never allowed farther than 1 step from him all evening, and bolted through the side door into the rear garden. He ran wildly down the gentle slope toward the vast lake, whose surface lay beneath a dull sheet of ice in the moonlight. Connor pursued him as far as the veranda, down the entire ramp, and all the way to the frozen shoreline where the wheelchair could go no farther. Then he shouted, his first shout of the entire night, and the sound carried across the silent lake. "Desmond, stop. There is an underground current on the eastern side. The ice there never thickens. Stop now." But the figure on the lake didn't stop. He even looked back and laughed, the sound breaking apart in the freezing wind, and he continued running straight toward the east, the shortest route to the opposite shore, the direction only someone who had once spent an entire winter beside the Fairhaven windows, overlooking the lake, would know was certain death. The crack of breaking ice sounded like a dry gunshot. Mackie rushed to the water's edge and threw a coil of rope with all the strength of a soldier's arm. It tore through the air, and the end landed on the ice only an arm's length from the widening fracture. Connor, both hands gripping the wheel rims until his knuckles turned white, shouted one last time from the shoreline. "Take the rope, Desmond. Take the rope." The man in the freezing water looked at the rope, then toward the shore, toward the cousin in a wheelchair offering him a path back to life. And in the moonlight, from the veranda, Sadie witnessed something she would never forget. Desmond Kavanagh turned his face away from the rope. One arm still clutched the leather case against his chest, while the other clawed toward the distant eastern shore. The man who had spent his life calling another man the Broken King would rather sink while embracing every one of his crimes than accept life from the hand of someone seated on four wheels. The ice around him gave one final crack, and the black water closed over him, becoming smooth and still as though it had never opened. The maternity emergency department at the county hospital was brightly lit at midnight, and the first words the attending physician spoke upon coming out, before Connor could even ask, were that both mother and baby were completely safe. The contractions had been caused by stress and had already subsided. There were no signs of concern. The patient had done exceptionally well and had regulated her own breathing throughout the journey. They wheeled Connor into the room where Sadie lay propped against high pillows, pale but smiling. The monitor beside the bed was producing that familiar, urgent rhythm. "The heartbeat is steady," the nurse said cheerfully. 140 beats per minute, strong as a festival drum. This little girl is every bit as stubborn as her mother. Connor Kavanagh, the man who had called 6 armed men by name without changing the pitch of his voice, the man who had watched the enemy of his life disappear beneath black water, without allowing his hands to tremble once, rolled his chair to the edge of the bed, took his wife's hand, listened to the tiny, rapid heartbeat filling the room, then lowered his head against the side of the bed. The broad shoulders of Boston's kingpin began to shake in waves he couldn't control, because it turned out that the tears of that man had never belonged to his enemies. He had kept them hidden for 20 months, saving them for a heartbeat. In the weeks following the night on the frozen lake, the truth stepped into the light piece by piece, in the order it deserved. Dr. Warren Hale fessed everything to the investigators, from the excessive doses he had administered for 20 months to the role he had played that Friday afternoon. Tobias Lawson was publicly cleared, with complete documentation proving that he had been deceived into signing, and the art student wept like a child when he embraced his sister in the courtyard of his school. As for Kayla Bennett, the young nurse who waited trembling for the day she would be dismissed, it was Sadie herself who asked Connor to let her remain, speaking a sentence that made even Birdie turn away to wipe her eyes. "She was trapped by her brother's debt, exactly as I once was, and she told the truth the first moment she was free to speak. That deserves a chance, not a sentence." The spring council session was held in the great hall of Blackwater House, and Connor Kavanagh presided over the entire gathering from his wheelchair, offering no preamble and no apology for the fact that he was seated. He placed Brendan's ledger and the investigative findings on the table, then announced something none of the elders had expected: a 5-year plan to bring every operation of the family fully into the light of the law, every harbor, every company, every dollar, completing the unfinished wish of his dead brother. When the eldest elder asked whether he was certain, Connor answered only, "My brother paid for that dream with his entire life. I am simply paying what remains." Then, one evening in early spring, when the snow had begun to retreat from the garden, Connor called Sadie into the library, where everything between them had begun, and gave her 2 things. The first was a small wooden box containing a storage device and a note from the technical department. She opened it, and her heart stopped for 1 beat when she read the line: "All 27 recovered voice messages from Daniel Reeves's telephone." The telephone destroyed in the ambush that she had believed had carried Danny's final words forever into the cold snow. "I am not replacing him," Connor said softly when she looked up through blurred eyes. "I will never try to do that. But our daughter has the right to grow up hearing the voice of the man who loved her before I did." And Sadie heard it then, for the first time, those 2 words, "our daughter," spoken as naturally as breath. The second thing was a thick file. He placed it in her hands and told her that it contained every document she would ever need: the right to leave whenever she wished, to take the child with her, to retain every promised allowance without obligation and without condition. "From this moment onward, there is no debt between us. The only thing that may keep you here, if anything does, must be something you choose for yourself." Sadie looked down at the cover of the file, where her eyes caught on a small printed line among the listed provisions: the Ruth Lawson Nursing Scholarship Fund for the children of harbor workers. She stood silent for a very long time, then set the file on the desk without opening it, walked to the wheelchair, and knelt until she was level with his eyes. She took both of his hands in hers. "Ask me," she said, her voice steady as stone. "Not as the man who saved my family. Not as the Duke of the Harbor or the ruler of this city. Ask me as Connor, and that man who had never trembled before any council had to draw one deep breath before he could speak. Sadie Lawson, will you stay and be my wife simply because you want to, and for no other reason in this world?" "Yes," she answered without a second of hesitation. "I choose you, Connor. Not the safety. Not the house. I choose you." Their daughter was born on an early spring morning, just as the new sunlight touched the hospital's tall windows. They named her Bren, after the uncle she would know only through stories. That morning in the maternity corridor, between Bertie soaking her handkerchief with tears and Mackie standing as solemnly as though he were attending a military review, the nurses witnessed a scene they would speak of for many years. Connor Kavanagh locked the braces beneath his trouser legs, gripped the ebony cane firmly in one hand, and slowly, little by little, rose from his wheelchair. His legs trembled, but his back remained straight. He stood on his own 2 feet at the exact moment the nurse emerged, carrying the baby, and he received his daughter into his arms as a father standing there to welcome her into the world. He remained upright for 1 complete minute, 1 minute during which the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. Then he lowered himself back into his wheelchair, without the slightest hesitation or shame, and held the sleeping child against his chest for the rest of the morning. Later, when Sadie told him that the garden paths needed to be repaved and made smooth because their daughter would need somewhere to practice walking beside her father, he simply nodded, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. On the day Bren turned 1 month old, Sadie took her to Cedar Point Care Home and placed the baby in Ruth's arms. In that sun-filled room, a small miracle occurred, one that medicine could never fully explain. The elderly woman gazed at the newborn's face for a long time, then slowly raised her head. Her clouded eyes suddenly cleared like the surface of a lake after the wind had passed, and she looked directly at her daughter. "Sadie," she said, "she looks exactly like you did when you were born. I remember it as though it were yesterday. It lasted only 10 seconds. Then the fog closed again, and Ruth smiled politely at the kind nurse, holding her granddaughter for her. But for those 10 seconds, Sadie Lawson had been her mother's daughter one more time. That evening, after returning to Blackwater House, she placed a small lamp on the windowsill of her daughter's room and turned it toward the bay, lighting it as her own mother had done during those distant years, so that her daughter would grow up understanding one simple truth, that home wasn't the largest or most beautiful place. Home was the place where someone always left a light burning to guide you back. Many months later, along the newly paved paths of the Blackwater Garden, the gardeners often stopped their work to watch a sight that made every one of them smile. Little Bren took the first uncertain steps of her life with both tiny hands gripping the wheel of her father's chair. The wheelchair moved slowly and steadily beside her, and her bright laughter rang across the sunlit garden, because the most beautiful ending to this story wasn't that a powerful man learned to walk again. It was that a father realized he had never needed to walk in order to teach his daughter how to take her first steps. The story ends here, and perhaps it leaves us with something worth carrying. That family isn't created by blood or contracts, but by the people who choose each day to remain and love us. That the worth of a human being has never rested in uninjured legs or a celebrated name, but in a heart brave enough to accept responsibility, brave enough to trust, and brave enough to love after every loss. And that sometimes the most precious gift we can offer one another isn't perfection, but an embrace that never lets go. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day, because the most beautiful stories are still waiting to be told. And my friend, how did this story make you feel? Which moment moved you most deeply? Please share the feelings from the depths of your heart in the comments below. We truly look forward to reading every line you wish to share. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments of this story. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.